The Grim Widow. The story of a mysterious wife and her husband's mysterious murder. By Steve Poole. Chapter 1. Screams from the Agee home. It was 12:20 a.m. on June 11th, 1921. Many were asleep, and all was silent along North Druid Avenue, in the dead center of the Portsmouth neighborhood, just east of St. John's in North Portland. A few blocks north of the hustle and bustle of Lombard Street, the block of Druid Avenue runs between Willis Boulevard to the north and Drew Street to the south, which was lined with a succession of modest homes, many of which no longer stand today. A check on documentation related to the homes in this area shows a mix of homes that predated 1921 as well as homes that were built in the middle 20th century. The location where the home of Harry and Anne Louise Agee was one such home that no longer stands. In what was 1770 Druid Avenue back then, now stands a modest one-story home constructed in 1955. The address at this site today is 8170 North Druid Avenue. I have not found any photographs or diagrams as to the structure of the Agee home. All I know is what was reported in local papers. By their description, it was a one-story structure which stood on the east side of Druid Avenue, only 2 houses south from its intersection with Willis Boulevard. It was a 2-bedroom home with the master bedroom located in the back left corner of the home. This is where Harry and Anne, along with their 2 children, lived and presumably were sleeping soundly, only minutes after midnight, when Anne was slowly roused from her sleep by a strange sound. As her eyes opened, she had to be perplexed, as the sounds of gurgling and gasping filled the air around her. She turned to her left to see her husband, Harry, gasping and struggling, blood spraying from his neck. His throat had just been freshly cut, and he was fearfully gasping out his final breaths. The mere fact that Harry was still alive, even as the blood rapidly left his body, meant the attack had just happened. Anne panicked, quickly came to her feet and fled the room into the main living room facing towards the front door of the home. As she arrived in this area, she saw a man flee out the front door. Anne would initially describe the man she saw as short and squat, but several hours later she would change this and state the man was tall and slim of build. She also stated the man may have had a handkerchief obstructing his face. Suddenly manic, Anne ran outside of the house but did not see what direction the man ran off in. She ran screaming from the property, north on Druid Street in the direction of Willis Boulevard. It was her screams that primarily roused many of her closest neighbors out of a dead sleep, and those who weren't asleep were ushered to their front doors to see what was happening. Reaching Willis Boulevard, Anne turned left, or westbound, and ran a block down to Willis and Haven Avenue, where a local neighbor and friend of hers, Miss R.E. Green, lived. Appearing frantic and incoherent, Green did her best to calm Anne and usher her back to her home. Maybe there was a chance that Harry was still alive. Upon their arrival back at the Agee home, as Anne and Green approached their front lawn from the street, Harry suddenly emerged in the front doorway of the home, bleeding out all over, bloodstains covering his clothes. As he slowly died, one can only assume he tried to do everything he could in these final moments to try and get help. He only made it as far as the front porch when he lost whatever energy he had left and collapsed. An ambulance was called for, quickly ushering Harry from the home in the direction of Good Samaritan Hospital, which unfortunately was more than 7 miles from the Agee home, and Harry hardly had any time left. The route taken to the hospital was never stated in any papers. However, the quickest route would have been to travel a few blocks south to Lombard Street, go east to Interstate Avenue, which would be taken south so they could cross the Broadway Bridge and travel into what is today the Nob Hill neighborhood, where Good Samaritan is located. Alas, the iconic St. John's Bridge would not be built for another 10 years, as traveling into St. John's, crossing the bridge and making a beeline down Highway 30 would have been a fairly easy route to reach the hospital. During the ride, paramedics said that Harry tried to say something, but with his windpipe literally cut, he couldn't manage any actual words. Harry Agee would be officially declared dead by the evening of June 11th, less than a day after he was attacked. Police arrived on the scene and quickly began their investigation. A razor, apparently caked in blood that would later be definitively identified as human blood, was found in the grass in the Agee's yard, approximately 25 feet from their front door. Thanks to recent rains, there was condensation mixed onto the razor's blade along with this blood. The razor was shown to Anne at the scene, and she did not recognize it as belonging to her husband or having come from their home. It was quickly presumed that this was the murder weapon, dropped by the assailant as he fled the home. The slight possibility that Harry had committed suicide by slitting his own throat, which was never seriously considered, was dismissed altogether when this razor was found several feet from the front door of his home. Harry never made it beyond their front porch. Harry was also never considered to be unduly depressed or suicidal. The possibility of a robbery gone wrong was an early theory in the case that never fully went away. In this case, a bundle of items belonging to the Agees was discovered in a pile along the south side of the house. They were located below a dining room window that was found to be locked. This location was on the opposite end of the house from the Agee's master bedroom, where Harry was attacked. This bundle consisted of a strange array of items, including a carving set, a watch, and multiple articles of jewelry, mostly belonging to Anne. The theory was rapidly being considered that a burglary effort had taken place, but that this was not necessarily the reason Harry's throat was slit. Whatever the case, with Anne waking up, the perpetrator had to flee the home and leave this small booty behind. Two experts in the Bertillon system, James Hunter and Fred Grover, were called to the home to gather evidence and examine what they could in relation to uncovering the killer of Harry Agee. The Bertillon system these men used for analysis was a once prominent and readily accepted method of crime scene examination, wherein as many details as possible in relation to an unknown guilty party would be gathered. These details could then be put together and utilized in looking into possible suspects. These details primarily focused in on things that could be measured, such as a person's height, weight, arm wing length, feet length, size of head, etc. The more of these specifics that could be established, the more of a solid description could be established for a perpetrator, even if he or she had never even been seen. For the sake of additional assistance, any other specific details that could be gathered, from prints to eye color to scars, would often be gathered as well. One can see, especially in a time wherein crime scene analysis was much more archaic than it is today, why such a method would be very popular in investigating unsolved crimes. The negative in regards to the Agee case was, if these various measurements and descriptive factors could be established, they could be used to find guilt in innocent people who just happen to match some of those figures established for the suspect. Just because, for instance, a perpetrator was 5 feet 10 inches tall, 200 pounds with brown hair and blue eyes, does not mean any random 5 foot 10, 200 pound, brown hair, blue-eyed individual would do. Obviously. In reality, the use of the Bertillon system to identify suspects provided weak circumstantial evidence at best. In Hunter and Grover's examination of the Agee home, they were hardly able to help. They searched for prints and, surprisingly, found none. This seems remarkable if the perpetrator was ransacking the home looking for items to steal. Even the looted items that were left outside the home had no prints on them. He must have been wearing gloves. In her modest description of the man she saw fleeing the home, Anne made no mention of seeing gloves on the man's hands. They also examined the razor for prints and found none. However, the razor had been left in the wet grass of the front yard for several minutes, and if there were any prints, it seemed the water eradicated them. This case was destined to be a nightmare for authorities to investigate. They had a potential murder weapon, but no detailed description on the suspect who fled the home or where he may have gone. An initial examination of the home turned up nothing that could be used to target any one specific individual. All the authorities had was a horrible tragedy and a shaken-up wife and her children, hoping for justice. But this is also only the initial description of the full story. Chapter 2. The Man on the Street. The first minutes of June 11th, 1921 were ones of shock and disbelief. We all know that people die, and sometimes die in horrific ways, but we try not to think about such things happening on our own street. But for the residents of Druid Street, they were experiencing that tragedy firsthand. They all heard Anne's screams as she ran from the home, and as they went towards the location of her screaming, they saw Harry, covered in blood, stumble to the front door and collapse. A bloody razor loomed quietly in the wet grass. But where was the killer? Where did the killer go? Even Anne Agee, only a short distance behind the killer, did not see where he ran off to. She just instinctively ran north in the direction of the green home. So, did anyone see the killer flee the area? Possibly. A man who would become critical to the case as a witness, Gordon E. Colgan, reported seeing a man in a dark overcoat flee from the area of the Agee home. Colgan finally, on the surface, provided a witness, aside from Anne Agee herself, who saw the assailant flee the home. However, Colgan's account was manipulated to a degree in the newspapers, as he stated himself he was standing about 60 feet east from the intersection of Portsmouth Avenue and Willis Boulevard. This location not only put Colgan almost 5 blocks east of the Agee home, but along Willis Boulevard, between where Colgan stood and where Druid Avenue would be, the road hooks slightly. I have been to this location personally and stood approximately where Colgan stood, and from that perspective one could barely see around this hook that Willis Boulevard makes. Colgan would not have been able to see anything beyond the intersection of Willis and Hereford, which is still 3 blocks west of Willis and Druid. Based on his own account, then, Colgan not only could not have seen the man approaching from the Agee home specifically, but he could not have even seen the man from a few blocks beyond the home. Even back in 1921, when most areas outside of the downtown Portland area were more sparsely populated, Colgan's perspective would have been obstructed by trees and, more specifically, houses. This in no way disproves the potential that Colgan saw the killer after he fled the crime scene, but we must equally dispel the myth that he saw the man approaching from near the home, as this was simply not possible. In his complete story, Colgan was in the process of dropping off a friend of his when he heard screaming coming from the east. He looked that direction and said about a minute later he saw a man walking west on Willis Boulevard wearing a long dark coat that stretched down to his knees. He held a hat in his hands, and Colgan made no reference as to whether the man had something obstructing his face, like, say, a handkerchief. The man looked back several times in the general direction of where the Agee home was, This may have been the actions of a guilty man nervously escaping the scene, but it may have also just been another bystander looking back in confusion after hearing screams in the distance. After this mystery man passed by Colgan, he reached Willis and Portsmouth, where he turned and traveled south onto Portsmouth, disappearing from Colgan's view. Once he made this turn, the man reportedly began running. Colgan did not personally see the man begin running himself, but said he heard the man's footsteps speed up once he went around the corner. He may have been walking to look casual at first, and then, when he got around the corner, began running when he thought the coast was clear. Another witness to this walking man was Laura Howes, who lived on the west side of Hereford Street in a small house that still stands today. She lived just 2 houses up from Hereford and Willis, placing her home about 3.5 blocks west of the Agee home. Interestingly enough, her perspective along Willis would pick up right around the corner from where Gordon Colgan's perspective along the same road would end. However, unlike Colgan, Howes never saw the man in question. She stated that she was awakened from a sound sleep, for what reason she was not sure, when she heard footsteps moving at a quick walking pace near her home. Howes is another witness whose honesty is a little hard to discern, but there are issues with her story, such as the unlikelihood that she would wake up randomly at the perfect moment to hear a man as he walked by. Furthermore, Howes could not have been any closer than 80 feet to where the man was walking, and that's assuming the man was walking on the north side of Willis Boulevard. If he was walking along the south side of Willis, which makes more sense if he turned the corner sharp to go south on Portsmouth, he would have been at least 110 feet away from Howes's home. Even if Howes had her bedroom window open to allow for more noise to enter the room, these footsteps would have sounded faint to her at best. It is also worth noting that Howes made no reference to hearing any screams, which, even from a distance away, would get anyone's attention, at least more than one's footsteps. Colgan heard the screams from nearly 2 more blocks away, and they immediately got his attention. Did Howes sleep through these screams but then ended up waking up to the sounds of footsteps from some 100 feet away? Because she never saw the man herself, it cannot be stated for certain that she saw the same man Colgan saw, but it can certainly be inferred. Another witness who heard but did not see this mystery man was an individual named G.T. Jepson, who was sleeping in a tent near the intersection of Willis and Portsmouth, only a short distance from where Gordon Colgan was. He also reported hearing screams and afterwards hearing footsteps going at a rapid pace down the sidewalk and past him. It's hard to discern whether this means the man was walking fast or running. Jepson did not poke his head out of his tent to get a look at this passerby. This leaves the last known official placement of this man, who may or may not have been the fleeing killer, at Portsmouth Avenue between Willis Boulevard to the north and Lombard Street to the south. Due to the makeup of Portsmouth Avenue, along this stretch, it ran almost 3 blocks between Willis and Lombard without any other crossing streets, meaning unless he randomly lived or hid along that stretch, this man would have ultimately reached the intersection of Portsmouth and Lombard. After that, nobody knows where he went. Considering the fact that there was a streetcar line that ran down Lombard, the theory was put forth that the reason this man may have been walking fast before breaking out into a run was that he may have been trying to catch a streetcar before it passed by. This might be deemed a stretch to some, but it's absolutely a possibility. However, if this was the true reason this man broke out into a run, it still doesn't prove or disprove that he may have been the killer. Authorities had at least a general idea as to where the killer might have fled from these witnesses, but without any definitive proof he even came directly from Willis and Druid, there was still plenty of room for doubt. The killer could have easily fled south on Druid, or ran north and fled east on Willis. Law enforcement had their work cut out for them, and it was not about to get any easier. Harry Agee was not exactly a man with an assortment of enemies who would have the motivation to break into his home and cut his throat while he slept beside his wife. Authorities were left having to pursue whatever theories were deemed even slightly possible, as they had very little to go on. One early theory came in relation to the fact that Harry Agee was once a town marshal in the town of Worland, Wyoming. Is it possible that someone he locked away had it out for him to such a degree that he tracked him all the way to Portland and killed him in his home? One particular individual who was only described as a man of Mexican descent was briefly considered as a suspect, as Harry had put him away back in 1917. This particular man had been recently released from jail. Anne denied the likelihood of this story, claiming that, as the town marshal, Harry mostly just dealt with deadbeats and drunks who usually only spent a night or two in jail. She said Harry was not high up enough to be involved in putting people away for years. Quickly, this town marshal theory fizzled. Harry Agee had reportedly had a few altercations with fellow workers at the job he was working when he was killed. This too was investigated by authorities, but it only led to another dead end. But it is worth noting, if nothing more than for the strangeness of it, that at the time of his death, Harry Agee was working for the Portland Gas and Coke Company. Oddly enough, this is the same company that a man named William Hill worked for back in 1911, when he and his entire family were all brutally hatcheted to death in their little cabin in the Ardenwald neighborhood just south of Portland. To this day, the Hill family murders remain unsolved. An escaped convict named Joe Doyle had broke out of prison in Boise, Idaho, a short while before Harry Agee's murder. Doyle just happened to hightail it to Portland after his escape, and was arrested in the Kenton neighborhood on the evening of June 11th, less than a day after Harry Agee was killed. He was briefly held as a suspect before authorities released him and had him sent back to Boise. The details of how Doyle was released so quickly are unknown, but it is of interest that he was captured in Kenton, which is the neighborhood bordering Portsmouth directly to the east. The Agee's home stood only 9 blocks from the Portsmouth-Kenton border. That's pretty close at a convenient time. However, the reason Doyle was serving time in Idaho was due to a sentencing in November 1920 for committing an act of criminal syndicalism. In essence, Doyle was something of an anarchist. I could not find the specific details about the kind of syndicalism that Doyle was involved in, but crimes of this type can range anywhere from small acts of vandalism up through terrorism. While anarchists have been known to commit acts of murder, they're almost always of a political nature. What are the odds that this random anarchist would break out of jail and travel all across Oregon to Portland and kill a man who he did not know, who was really just another working stiff? Another dead end. Harry Agee appeared to fit that classic mold of the man who had no enemies. Having minor scrapes with coworkers and friends is one thing, but it was not likely to drive anyone to break into his home in the middle of the night and cut his throat. But the problems of finding a valid suspect in this murder was only the beginning of the problems that law enforcement faced in this case. Chapter 3. Holes in the Story. It was the story about town all across Portland in every neighborhood. The cold-blooded, seemingly motiveless murder of a local man about town. Left behind was the widow who had to endure the discovery of her husband as he lay there dying. Their 2 children, ages 6 and 3, awakened from a sound sleep by the commotion, only to come out and discover their father bleeding out and struggling to escape the house. After 24 hours, the police had no idea who the guilty party could be, with the only evidence they had going for them being that assumed perpetrator, who fled north to Willis Boulevard and was last seen, or heard, going south towards Lombard Street from along Portsmouth Avenue. That was it. All Agee had to offer about the man, again, was that he was short and somewhat heavy-set, with something, possibly a handkerchief, covering his face. Shortly after this, she would say the man was actually tall and thin. There was no mention in her initial description as to whether the man wore a long coat or not, as the man that was seen walking down Willis Boulevard wore such a coat. She also stated that she was awakened by the sounds of Harry gasping and struggling to breathe, at which time she got out of bed and upon exiting the bedroom saw someone running from the house. She ran out of the house herself, not seeing where the assailant ran, and she ultimately ended up at the home of the Greens just over a block away. As the investigation took off and law enforcement had the opportunity to begin digging into the case, which obviously would include looking into the wife of the murder victim, there were many troubling aspects as to Anne's account that came to light. It was immediately troubling to everyone that Anne claimed she was awakened by the sounds of Harry gasping and struggling to breathe with his throat cut. There was no mention that Harvey may have been flopping around aggressively, at which time he struck Anne or shook her into a awakened state. That would have been far more believable. It was simply that Anne was asleep and was awakened by her husband's throaty sounds, which would have been hardly audible. However, it appears if anything was going to awaken Anne, it would have been when the attack was taking place, wherein the killer walked up to the bed and slit Harry's throat. The attacker would have likely leaned onto the edge of the bed, making it shuffle to a degree, which would wake up just about anybody. Also, the moment that Harry's throat was slit, he would have been awakened, and it appears at that point at least a brief struggle might have ensued. This would make for more shuffling of the bed, again likely waking up Anne. It was very difficult for people to believe, on its face, that Anne was rousted out of a sound sleep in the way that she said she was, and it's possible she knew this. On July 12th, the day after the murder, Anne changed this portion of her story, now saying that she was awakened from bed by the sounds of Harry calling out for help. This created an initial, more believable scenario wherein Anne was awakened by yelling, which was happening right next to her. Even with it being a questionable alteration against what she initially said, this seemed, in the moment, to add credibility to her story as to how she was awakened. The problem with this new story, however, was that Harry's throat had been slit so deeply that it cut open his windpipe. This would have rendered him barely able to make a vocal sound at all, and, as we must remember, paramedics in the ambulance taking him to Good Samaritan Hospital said that Harry tried to speak, but due to his injury, he could not. This brings one back to the drawing board with regards to this aspect of Anne Agee's claims, neither of which made much sense. It also opened the floodgates for various forms of speculation, suggesting Anne must have never been asleep in the first place. If this was the case, then how did an assailant get into their home and attack her husband without her interference? And, more importantly, why did she create the story that she was awakened by her husband calling out for help? But this was not the only element of Anne's story that altered in the aftermath of her husband's murder. Anne would also later state that when she woke up, she climbed across Harry's body before exiting the bedroom. In her first explanation of events, she said that she simply climbed out of her side of the bed and ran from the room. It did not seem logical or necessary for her to engage in such an act as climbing across Harry's body, especially as he lay there gasping and spraying blood all over the place. The only reason I could ascertain as to why Anne would add this piece to her story is if she would be trying to provide an explanation as to why she had a bunch of Harry's blood on her. However, in the initial aftermath of the crime, there was nothing reported in terms of whether or not Anne had blood on her clothes, and if she did, how much blood was on them. As trial testimony would later bear out, it was firmly established that Anne had no blood on her person in the aftermath of the murder. This complicated matters, but it also suggested that if Anne was perhaps responsible for the killing of her husband, she was creating an explanation for being covered with blood. Creating a cover story here would obviously implicate her in the murder and suggest that she felt it would be a foregone conclusion that she would have blood on her if she had slit her husband's throat. With it later reported that Anne had no blood on her person, this claim of climbing over her husband's body looms as extremely questionable. But it appears, whether she was responsible or not, with blood spraying from her husband's throat, that she would have been covered with a considerable degree of blood if she had, in fact, climbed over Harry's body. It truly made no sense, but more importantly, it could not have been the truth. Her description of the immediate aftermath of leaving her bedroom and discovering a man running for the door to escape does not make much sense either, for a few reasons. One, it only makes sense that after the man cut Harry's throat that he would immediately flee the crime scene if murder was his only objective. If he had ransacked the home and looked for items to steal, he would have them ready to go. He wouldn't cut a man's throat, invariably waking him up, and then just go on ransacking the home. In fact, with it appearing that both Harry and Anne were asleep when the assailant would have been ransacking the home, he would have had no reason to kill anyone, even if, for the sake of argument, he snuck into the bedroom and began rifling through their belongings. Witnesses did notice in the aftermath of the murder that dresser drawers were opened up in the room and a checkbook and Anne's purse were oddly scattered on the floor, almost suggesting a botched and brazen robbery attempt of the bedroom. Still, the killer would have only attacked, potentially, if one of the Agees woke up. However, Anne is supposed to have been asleep while Harry was not awakened until he was attacked. In no strict robbery scenario does the murder of Harry Agee make any sense whatsoever. Yet, if Anne Agee's account of what happened is to be believed, the perpetrator cuts Harry's throat, at which time he begins to struggle, bringing Anne out of a dead sleep, presumably a few seconds later. She wakes up, looks over, and comes to terms with what is happening before her eyes. Only then does she climb out of bed, possibly climbing across Harry's body, and make her way out of the bedroom where she sees the killer fleeing. And all that time after the killer struck and fled the bedroom, even as Anne got into the hallway, the man was still only on his way to the front door to escape the home. Even if it only took some 10 seconds from the throat being cut to Anne exiting the bedroom, that would have been more than enough time for the killer to already have exited the home. The Agee home, again, was a simple and average-sized structure that, at a running pace, a grown man could have traversed from one end to the other inside of 5 seconds. This description of events can only infer that the killer, for whatever reason, remained lingering in the house for several seconds. But why? And again, if it was just a robbery gone wrong, why did the killer not take any loot with him? It became clear, at least in the eyes of some, that Anne's whole story about seeing this man flee the house may have just been a fabrication on her part because she was actually responsible, at least to some degree, for murdering her husband. Thus, As her artificial account is thrown together, we have oddities such as this because it is not based on a factual account. Mistakes can be made. This might further explain the strange fact that Anne admitted to never seeing what direction the killer ran off in. This is a second point. However, by her own account, she was only steps behind the perpetrator, and right after he ran outside, she did the same. Is it to be believed that while these two were separated by the length of a small living room, that by the time they were both outside, this man had gained such an advantage that he would be completely out of Anne's view by the time she exited her home? Even if the killer took a quick turn and ducked into some bushes, it seems likely that Anne would have caught a glimpse of him still. Back during this time, many homes in neighborhoods such as this had fairly open properties, with there often not even being fences separating yards. As she reached the front door to her home, even from that location, she would have had a far and wide-reaching perspective of the general area around her, and nobody that close to her could have escaped her eye. Considering the likelihood that the killer's escape route would have been seen by Anne when she fled the house becomes even more viable if they both fled in the same direction. Again, the presumed killer, seen walking west on Willis Boulevard shortly after Anne's screams were heard, must have gone north on Druid from the Agee home up to Willis Boulevard and turned left or in a western direction. With the Green home standing at Willis and Haven, Anne would have also had to run north on Druid and turn left on Willis. Even if the killer somehow got a large start on her, once Anne reached Willis, she would have had a clear view down the boulevard for a few blocks before it hooked slightly north, near where Gordon Colgan first saw the man approaching. It's beyond belief that she would not have seen the man escaping down Willis Boulevard, and it seems if she did see him, she would have followed him, at least at a distance, screaming for help or somebody to stop the man. This did not happen, but rather Anne just ran straight to the Green home to explain to them what had just happened. This is a complication in Anne's account that simply cannot be ignored. Her actions are anything but logical and, in many regards, anything but factual during this time. In calling back to these witnesses who saw the mystery man walking on Willis Boulevard, we must remember that the star witness to the mystery man, Gordon Colgan, stated that he heard screaming, no doubt from Anne Agee. He then stated that about a minute later, he first caught sight of this man. If this was the killer, the same man Anne saw fleeing from her home, it only further bolsters the fact that they would have been close together and that she must have seen him, up to the point that they were both moving west on Willis Boulevard. With this minute time gap, it shows the man would have been in close proximity of Druid and Willis, around the time that Anne was outside screaming, and running towards that very intersection. Another issue was the loot that had been taken from the Agee home and deposited outside on the south side of the home. When this loot was found, it was directly beneath a closed and locked window. Logically, the killer may have ransacked a few items and tossed them out the window before closing and locking it, leaving them there for when he exited the home. He then went to the master bedroom and killed Harry Agee. But there are definite problems with this logic, beyond the question, again, of why he would kill him to begin with. First off, why would the killer deposit these items along the side of the house when they would logically be fleeing out the front door? Why not keep them next to the front door to scoop up as you left? Beyond this, one of the items of jewelry found in the loot was a bracelet that Anne later said she had on her wrist when she fell asleep. Some question why she would not take off such an item before going to bed, but perhaps she was just not paying attention and dozed off with the bracelet on. This would mean the killer either took the bracelet off her wrist as she slept, or, more likely, the bracelet fell off Anne's wrist as she slept and the killer picked it up off the floor. This still sounds strange, as it implies once more that the killer must have entered the bedroom, wherein found Anne's bracelet, picked it up, and either deposited it outside with the other items or tossed it out the window, adding it to items he'd already placed out there. So he enters the room, then leaves the room with the bracelet before coming back to the room to finally kill Harry. And all of this for a bracelet that the killer could have easily stuffed into a pocket without having to leave the room. And it would have had to happen in that order because otherwise we would have to believe the man killed Harry and then tossed the bracelet outside before fleeing the home, and apparently leaving it behind. Bit by bit, the known details of Anne's account were really starting to come apart. With no other viable suspects, and with seemingly no real enemies who would take Harry's life so viciously, the authorities focused their investigation more on the widow in the case. The greatest shift, and likely the overall catalyst in the authorities pushing for a grand jury in this case, was the bombshell dropped by a local Portland musician named Joseph C. Klecker. On June 15, 1921, only 3 days after Harry's murder, Klecker was taken into police custody as a witness after admitting that he had been engaged in an affair with Anne Agee. Only a day later, June 16th, a grand jury was called together to determine whether charges should be brought against the same Anne Agee in the murder of her husband. Chapter 4. The Grim Widow. June 16th, 1921. A grand jury was called to examine evidence and conduct witness testimony to determine whether Anne Louise Agee should be charged with first-degree murder in the killing of her own husband. While numerous oddities and unlikelihoods were uncovered in her account of events, considering the time in which the murder case occurred, the revelation of a Joseph Klecker as Anne's, quote, lover was definitely a critical factor in the authorities questioning her credibility. To many everyday Americans during this time, adultery was sometimes worse than murder, and Anne Agee was suddenly facing judgment for both. Up until this revelation, Anne's behavioral patterns were deemed relatively normal at first before shifting to a place of questionable conduct, at least in the eyes of the general public. She was a fairly short and petite woman with a full and round face. Her hair was in ringlets, which was an extremely common hairstyle for the 1920s, that rendered one's hair extremely wavy. In another commonality of the 1920s, her hair was fairly short, just above the shoulders. Her nose was very rounded at its base, giving the classic camera trick of appearing larger than it really was in photographs taken of her. Most available imagery of Anne, which are photographs taken after her husband's death, depict her with a frowning expression showing very defined marks going into her lower cheeks from her mouth. This look almost created the impression that her mouth was stuck that way, like she never smiled. Her eyes always appeared the same, as though disinterested and disconnected, like she was looking through and past everything in front of her. In no photographs of her that I could find were her brows ever raised, making for no change in the shape of her eyes. There was no emotion to her expression, like she was unaware what was going on. I found only one image of her wherein she appeared genuinely saddened, and this image appeared to be staged, as far as I'm concerned. She had an almost spinster quality to her, not to criticize her appearance, but rather to address how weathered she appeared. Again, at least one of these images I found of Anne was taken before Harry's death, in which she looked the same as she did after his death. This means that Harry's death did not, alone, have a devastating effect on her overall appearance. She also often wore clothing with bib-like collars that were often black in color. However, the fact that her husband had recently died only made it sensible that she would dress in such dark colors. The 1920s were what one may call the latter years of society's acceptance of what was dubbed the unwritten law. In short, this was a time where adultery was deemed almost as bad, and again, sometimes worse than murder. If a man caught another man with his wife, defiling his family home, and he attacked and killed that lover as a result, that man would often get off, or, worst case, would be given a light sentence. Men or women who fooled around with other married people were considered the scum of the earth who deserved everything they got. However, while the lover was often deemed as the lowest form of humanity, whomever they were engaged in an affair with were also seldom looked upon in a fair light. Hence, despite being the married woman, the revelation of this affair did not help Anne Agee's case, especially since it provided a potential motive as to why she might kill her husband. There were numerous cases of killing that occurred in relation to the unwritten law in Portland's history, most of which occurred before 1921, but definitely showed the validity that was given to such a, quote, law. In June 1907, a bathhouse worker named Charles Reynolds stormed into his home, catching his wife, Lulu, with a man whom she'd been engaged in an affair with named George Hibbins. Reynolds pulled a gun and shot Hibbins several times. Hibbins managed to escape the house and make it to his hotel before collapsing and dying from his wounds. Reynolds went on trial, and not only was he acquitted of murder, but the jury was out less than 20 minutes, and when he was acquitted, the crowd in the courtroom broke out in a standing ovation. The unwritten law at work. Another incredible case, whose conclusions can only be attributed to the societal acceptance of the unwritten law, is the killing of a man named Andrew Masson, who was gunned down by a man named George Chamberlain in 1910. After being convinced there was an affair going on between Masson and his wife, Chamberlain left his home to go to work, but instead hid under the porch of his home, which once stood directly behind where the iconic Mission Theater stands at 17th Avenue and Gleason Street in northwest Portland, awaiting the arrival of Masson. When he watched Masson go into his home, Chamberlain stormed in, catching the two in bed and killing Masson, who managed to stumble from the house before dying in a nearby alleyway. Like Charles Reynolds, George Chamberlain was never convicted of murder. In fact, his case went before a grand jury, and the grand jury determined that his actions were justified and that he should be released. A rare example of a man committing premeditated murder and not even having to go on trial before being set free. This case was buried so deep in the perspectives of the unwritten law that there was literally an article published about Chamberlain's grand jury decision on December 24th, 1910 that was titled, "Unwritten Law Frees Murderer." Again, while by 1921 we were going into the twilight of the unwritten law, it was still alive and breathing, and it was destined to have significant effects on the Harry Agee case. Joseph Klecker, the other man, worked as a janitor at the Henry Building, which still stands today at Southwest 4th Avenue and Oak Street in downtown Portland. While he worked here, he was also a working musician. He lived in Southeast Portland with his sister on Harrison Street near its intersection with 39th Avenue, today known as Cesar Chavez Boulevard. Considering how transportation about town was still a fairly inconvenient venture, with cars still being a relatively new commodity and with many citizens still relying on streetcars to get around town, it's a wonder how Klecker and Anne Agee ever came together. Klecker lived far enough from his place of work as it was, but he also lived some 10 miles from the Agee home. He was steadily a South Portlander, while Anne was a North Side Portlander. But whatever the case, the two met, and Klecker would begin teaching Anne how to play the trombone around the beginning of March 1921. While he taught Anne, she would become part of a performing band that he was also a member of. Klecker would further state that he'd visit the Agee home multiple times and had met Harry personally. As often happens in most affairs, what maybe starts as an innocent connection between two people became something much stronger. Klecker would state that the two had been intimate with each other as recently as a couple days before Harry Agee was killed. What was most interesting about Klecker's revelation that he'd been having an affair with Anne is the apparent fact that nobody really seemed to know about it. Klecker had discussed it with a few individuals with whom he'd worked with, but even then, these people were unlikely to come out and expose this affair just because the woman's husband had been murdered. As friends and co-workers, they'd likely feel no reason to think that this seemingly docile musician would have been involved in something so brutal. When it came out, the affair was a shock to everyone, which begs the question as to why Klecker willingly came forward and spilled the beans in the first place. He had to know this would have horrible effects on his reputation, and that it might possibly establish a motive for him to want to kill Harry Agee, or at least work as an accomplice with Anne. Even though authorities immediately started working with the possible theory that Anne and Klecker worked together to kill her husband, Klecker's actions in this case hardly seemed to be the actions of a guilty man. A guilty man would not come out and openly admit an affair with the very woman who was, by then, a widow. A guilty man would not reveal the very thing that would make him look guilty, the affair itself, when nobody seemed to know about it. In fact, if he were guilty and looking to save his own skin, he would have most likely stayed out of it altogether and tried to act naturally while Anne went down for the crime. This is, unless Klecker, as the old tragedy goes, loved Anne so much that he could not handle seeing her go down. But in this vein, why would he only come out and admit having an affair with her, and then nothing more? He loved her so much that he wouldn't take part of the rap for her? That he would only admit enough to ruin her reputation and bolster the case against her as the killer? As a guilty man, Klecker's behavior made absolutely no sense. Now, as an innocent man in the crime, it's still a wonder why he would come out of the woodwork at this time. Maybe he wanted some attention. Maybe he felt that somehow, some way, his affair would be discovered and that it would look very suspicious that he kept it hidden. Thus, instead he ratted the two of them out to law enforcement. Only Klecker knows the exact reason why he came forward when he did. Klecker's sister, Josephine Corton, whom he lived with, was called to the grand jury to verify or dismiss the details of Klecker's claim. She verified to them that the affair was real. However, with her brother coming under suspicion, she was a critical witness as to his whereabouts the night of Harry's murder. By Klecker's own account, he played with a band on the evening of June 10th, only hours before the murder, before he went to his workplace at the Henry Building, where he conducted some janitorial work before heading home. He stated that after arriving at home, he had a smoke and read for about 30 minutes before going to bed. However, by total chance, on this particular night, Corton left the house and spent the night with relatives in Gresham, just east of Portland. Because of this, she could not verify that Klecker had gone home that night, and that he was at home when Harry was murdered. This left Klecker without an alibi for his actions, preventing him from being dismissed as possibly being directly involved in the murder case. With Klecker revealing their affair, Anne immediately obtained a lawyer who advised her, as many lawyers do, to say nothing to anyone about anything. But before she clammed up, when the revelation of the affair was brought to Anne's attention, she implied there was nothing going on. She claimed to have had a strong but platonic relationship with Klecker. She even stated that she was planning on quitting the band that she played in with him, but Harry, of all people, convinced her to stay. Following directions, Anne's new lawyer even pushed that, from now on, in order to get cooperation from Anne whenever she was to be questioned, there could be no more than one officer present, and that a stenographer could not be present. This hardly helped to make Anne look innocent, and the authorities, understandably, did not agree to these restrictions. In essence, this is where Anne Agee's cooperation with law enforcement reached an impasse, and this was only a couple of days after the murder had occurred. This also prevented her from having to address and explain her actions of events again, which may have possibly revealed even more discrepancies. It seems her lawyer was aware that she was already not doing herself any favors by speaking, and thus shut that avenue of communication down. The Klecker admission also led to the floodgates opening in regards to speculation about the state of the Agee's marriage. Were they unhappy, leading Anne into the arms of her music teacher? Did these two want to be together, but Harry would not give Anne a divorce? Did they bond together to kill Harry so that they could finally be free together? Were the Agees unhappy? These were all incredibly difficult questions to answer, as nobody who knew the Agees seemed to have the same answer. Some said their marriage was not as happy as one might assume. It was even reported in a local newspaper that the police were looking for a woman, whose name was never given, who had reportedly stated a couple of months before Harry's murder that Anne had visited a divorce lawyer. As far as I can tell, there were no further reports on this woman. Her identity was never reported, and it was never fully verified whether or not Anne had actually gone to see a divorce lawyer. On the opposite end of the spectrum were those who stated they knew the Agees well and never saw a hint of unhappiness in their marriage. In particular, there were the Greens, who had visited Anne and Harry the night before the murders and claimed that all seemed well and that both of them were in high spirits. Was this true? Or was it that Harry was well because he did not know his life was soon to end, and Anne was merely portraying the idea that they were happy and well so she would be less likely to come under suspicion for the murders later on? Had they ever been unhappy? Lots of questions without answers. So were the Agees unhappy? Had they ever been unhappy? The two had actually met and married in Missouri, where their families originally hailed from. Harry's own brother, Fred Agee, was on the forefront in arguing the idea of Anne killing Harry as being absolutely ludicrous. Fred was 20 years older than Harry and was his primary caretaker when he grew up, as their parents died when they were young. Not long after getting married, Harry and Anne relocated to Oregon but maintained constant correspondence to their families some 2,000 miles away. Reportedly, in these many correspondences, there was never a hint of trouble or lack of happiness in the marriage. Fred would make the long trek west to Portland to recover Harry's body after death, which was returned to Missouri where he was buried. According to findagrave.com, Harry's body was buried at Hillcrest Cemetery in Mountain Grove, Missouri. Fred also took custody of the Agee's younger daughter and brought her back to Missouri, presumably to keep her close to family and to keep her away from the trauma of seeing her mother be scrutinized for her father's death. Unfortunately, their other child, Vernon, would become an important witness in the case, and therefore could not leave Portland. A major effect on witnesses, as well as law enforcement and the grand jury, was how they perceived Anne's behavior in the days after Harry was murdered. There was no doubt that she ran screaming from their home and that she appeared frantic and erratic when she arrived at the Greens' home. But aside from that, most who witnessed Anne's demeanor in this immediate aftermath of the murder described her as cold, distant, and unmoved. She appeared to some as completely unshaken by the death of her husband. When several neighbors were questioned about what they saw in the immediate aftermath, several of them expressed that Anne appeared the least moved by what was happening of everyone who had gathered outside their home. That behavior on Anne's part forces us to acknowledge the old adage that different people respond to different things in different ways. Was Anne simply in a state of shock that left her seemingly distant? Or was it that she truly did not mind that her husband had just died, because she wanted him dead? Or was it something else entirely? Her abrupt decision to quit assisting in the police investigation effort, wherein her help as the only living witness was critical, only served to bolster feelings that she did not really care or that she had something to hide. This seemingly passive behavior on Anne's part ultimately led to her being nicknamed the Grim Widow by local press. She showed little to no emotion and generally just had a lost look in her eyes. She was often seen and photographed all in black, almost as though she was perpetually prepared for a coming funeral. Maybe it was all a part of her dark facade. Maybe she was just a broken woman at this point, especially as she was being forced before a grand jury to fend off theories that she was responsible for her husband's death. Alas, all we have to go on are references in local newspapers which, the further back one goes, even the more reputable newspapers were known to practice deception and exaggeration to at least some level. Therefore, how disconnected or distant Anne Agee actually was cannot be fully understood by us today. Another unfortunate aspect of past generations of the press, which is still a reality today, is how they serve to alter public opinion, sometimes to an irreversible level. We've seen this historically in cases such as the trial of Bruno Richard Hauptmann, who was tried and convicted for the abduction and murder of Charles Lindbergh's infant son in 1932, the crime of the century when it occurred. Whether Hauptmann was guilty of the crime, he had already been convicted in the eyes of the press and the public by the time of his trial. Another infamous case, wherein the victim may have been guilty, was the case of Sam Shepard, who was convicted of murdering his wife in Cleveland, Ohio in 1954, after being essentially convicted in the public's mind. The fact of the matter is, no matter what the time or the circumstances, there is not one particular way that everyone is going to act under a certain set of circumstances. This fact is much better understood now than it would have been in 1921. But the fact of the matter is, some people respond with coldness and distance in the aftermath of a tragedy or the death of a loved one. This may have just been Anne Agee's way of processing and dealing with things. But regardless of her own personal circumstances, the public had a firmly established perspective. When a loved one dies, especially if you're a woman, you are an erratic, emotional mess. Since Anne Agee did not act this way, she must have had something to hide. But if the sudden reveal of a lover, compiled with her seemingly strange behavior, wasn't enough, one of the strongest testimonies before the grand jury against her came from her own 6-year-old son, Vernon. Vernon had been awakened from bed by the commotion going on in the house, but he did not see anything of incriminating significance. However, while Anne made the earlier statement that she did not recognize the blood-covered razor found in her yard, Vernon's testimony suggested otherwise. The razor discovered on the Agee's lawn was black in color. Another razor was found in the home that was white in color. Anne told authorities that Harry only owned one razor, and that it was white. This helped defend her claim that the black razor found outside was not theirs, but presumably brought into the home by the killer. But when Vernon Agee took the stand and was asked how many razors his father had owned, his response was 2. Vernon stated that his dad had owned a black razor as well as a white razor. This was a massive claim in the case, even if it was from a small child, in that it suddenly created the possibility that the bloody razor in the yard did, in fact, belong to Harry Agee. Why then did Anne deny so abruptly that it belonged to him? Why would her little boy know Harry owned 2 razors, but she wouldn't? Vernon's claim only damaged Anne's credibility even more. It certainly appeared that Anne was lying to cover up the fact that the possible murder weapon had belonged to them. Certainly killers in the past have used weapons from inside the homes of their victims, and thus it would not be impossible that the killer had stumbled upon one of Harry's razors and decided to use it in the murder. But still, if this were the case, It does not explain why Anne would be so certain that the black razor found in the yard did not belong to her husband if he did, in fact, own such a razor. If the murder, again, was either a planned murder or a robbery gone awry, both instances suggest situations wherein the killer would have brought his own weapon. In the case of premeditated murder, of course, the killer would bring his own weapon and not leave it to chance that he would be able to find a satisfactory weapon within the home. And in the case of a botched robbery, it still doesn't make sense. The killer gathers up a few belongings before stopping and searching around for a weapon, ultimately stumbling onto Harry's black razor, presumably in the bathroom, which he then storms in the bedroom with to kill him. Again, the unprovoked murder of a man who was fast asleep during a robbery with a weapon that the killer would have to search around to find. It is bizarre on its face, but if Vernon Agee's words are to be believed, and kids are usually pretty honest, then the killer used a razor found in the home, and thus one of these odd premises for the guilty man would have to fit. Under these circumstances, it would be far more believable that Anne Agee, who would already be there and know where Harry's razors would be, went and grabbed a razor and cut her husband's throat with it. She then tossed it aside when she fled the home, so it would be found later and, hopefully, blamed on some mystery man who fled the home in the aftermath. After 3 days of testimony, come June 18, 1921, the grand jury brought down an indictment of murder in the first degree against Anne Agee and the murder of her husband, Harry Agee. While Anne had sat stoic and silent throughout the proceedings, when this indictment was brought down, she broke down crying, apparently the most emotion she had shown since the moments immediately after Harry's throat was cut. She later fainted when she was taken to a jail cell after the indictment. When she was revived, she appeared hazy and disoriented, but also asked to see Harry's body. Of the primary reasons the grand jury had for indicting Anne, they were reported as follows. 1. Anne had been exhibiting cold and unmoved behavior almost continuously since her husband's death. The grand jury deemed that this type of behavior was unusual for a wife enduring Anne's circumstances. 2. It was found unlikely to unbelievable that she would have been awakened simply by hearing the gurgling sounds her husband was making. 3. Joseph Klecker's claims of having an affair with Anne appeared genuine and had verification provided from Klecker's own sister. The revelation of this affair provided a possible motive for Anne to murder her husband. And 4. In correlation with point number 2, as much as it was unbelievable to the grand jury that Harry's gurgling sounds would wake Anne up, they also dismissed her replacement claim that she was awakened by Harry calling out for help. A physician was called to testify on this matter to the grand jury, and he stipulated that, with the nature of Harry's injury, he would have not been able to speak, much less call out loudly for help. In the aftermath of the grand jury, the trial for Anne Agee was set for September 1921, but was ultimately moved up to late July at the request of Anne's appointed lawyer, John Collier. It was assumed this request was made to get proceedings going as quickly as possible and leave the prosecution with as little time as possible to be prepared for the case, where they had to know they had their work cut out for them. But whatever the odds of her conviction or acquittal, the grim widow was going to face justice. Chapter 5. The Trial of the Year. Anne Agee's experience facing the legal system did not begin well, as she was supposed to be arraigned to make her plea on June 27, 1921, but she never showed. Apparently not facing any repercussions for this, her arraignment was simply bumped ahead a couple of days to June 29th. Anne did appear for this arraignment, where she pled not guilty to the murder of her husband. This was when the trial was initially set for September before being bumped up to the latter part of July. After Anne's arraignment, nearly a month before the beginning of her trial, the case went quiet for the first time since the murder happened. With no updates, there was nothing to report, and yet the whole city of Portland waited with unshakable anticipation for when the trial was to begin on July 25th. On the defense for Anne Agee, she was represented again by lawyer John Collier, who would do everything in his power to show that, essentially, anyone besides Anne was responsible for her husband's murder. On the prosecution side was Portland Chief Assistant District Attorney Joseph Hammersley. As mentioned previously, Attorney Colliers pushed for an early start date for the trial. In addition to giving the prosecution less time to prepare, it was also believed he did this so as to provide less time to establish a jury. It was claimed, at Collier's denial, that he was pushing to establish a jury lacking in female representation. Months before this trial, a woman on trial in Cleveland, Ohio, for the killing of her husband, had an emotional meltdown when there were women placed on her jury. She clamored that she was never going to let any woman decide her case. This was ultimately effective, as all the women that were on the jury were removed and replaced by men. If this claim was valid, then it appears Anne Agee's defense was merely trying to avoid a similar possible occurrence. Anne hardly seemed to be the type to have a sudden meltdown in the middle of her trial, but who's to say? The trial was barely underway on July 25th when it was already noted by the prosecution that Anne had altered her account of events yet again. By the time the trial had begun, Anne had added to her description of the man she saw in that he wore a white mask or handkerchief obstructing his face. She also conveniently added to her account that the man wore a dark or black overcoat. While she never mentioned any type of coat on the man she saw in the days following the murder, the Gordon Colgan account of seeing a man approaching from the general area of the Agee home indicated the man wore a long dark overcoat. It seems pretty clear that Anne added this detail to her account to connect the man she saw leave the house with the man seen walking several blocks away from her home. But the fact remains, until this point, that there was nothing about Anne's account that connected these two men. Colgan also said the man was holding a hat in his hand. Anne never reported seeing the killer wearing a hat or having one in his possession. Whatever the case, and despite these conflicts, it was being made pretty clear out of the gate that Anne's defense team was going all out on the theory that a mysterious burglar, likely with an axe to grind with Harry Agee, had broken into their home, killed him, and then fled north along Willis Boulevard, where he was seen and or heard by multiple witnesses. It is very interesting that, at first, the defense was in deep dedication to the burglary aspect of the case, explaining why the man wore some kind of cloth covering his face, as this would be a common tactic for someone committing a burglary while concealing their identity. However, beyond defending the idea that the killer was a burglar, the defense just as quickly staked the claim that the stolen loot that was left outside of the Agee home was planted there sometime after the murder took place. So, it was a burglar who committed a murder and then altered the scene to make it look like a burglary took place without taking any actual loot? Anne Agee's defense was not exactly off to a great start. The defense would rely heavily on the testimony of Agee's neighbor, Thomas Jewell, who was reportedly the first person who went into the Agee home after the murder. He would claim that the house did not appear to be ransacked in any way, in conflict with other accounts. But what was critical is that the man admitted going into the Agee's master bedroom, and that he saw Anne Agee's bracelet, that was later found among the loot outside, laying on the floor of the bedroom. It was also reported that a watch belonging to Harry was discovered amongst the loot outside the house. Like the bracelet, Jules stated that while he was in the bedroom, he saw Harry's pants on the floor. He checked the pants pocket and found Harry's watch right there inside. This account was used by the defense to make the logical argument that the loot truly was staged there, to make the situation look like a burglary, to cover up the real objective of cold-blooded murder. If Anne's bracelet and Harry's watch were in the bedroom right after the murder, then somebody must have picked it up and moved it outside. Once again, the question must be asked. Why? Why would a killer, whether they were robbing the home or not, place a fake pile of left-behind loot outside the Agee home to deceive everyone? I simply cannot conjure up a logical reason why a killer would stage a burglary by throwing random items outside a window along the south side of the house. All this said, there is another account in this case that almost serves to defend Jules' claims that this loot was not left outside at the time of the murder. R.E. Green, the husband of Mrs. Green, would testify that he assisted a patrolman, M.T. Fleming, in searching the general vicinity around the Agee home shortly after the murder. While an approximate time for this was never given, it was implied this happened right at the start of the investigation of the crime scene. Green stated that, as they searched along the south side of the house, that they did not see any loot out there, further implying it must have been left there sometime after. Despite this claim, other investigators on the scene expressed that right after they arrived and searched the location that they found this loot along the south side of the home. While Green's testimony may have been honest, it is countered by most investigators. Green was also a close friend with the Agees and thus would have a possible motive to alter his testimony to help the defense. Furthermore, when Patrolman Fleming was called to testify, even though he was the man searching with Green, he reported seeing the loot along the south side of the house when he searched the area. So apparently, in this regard, this is just a he said type of situation. Do you believe Citizen Green, or do you believe Patrolman Fleming? Now, why is it so important to understand the source of this loot? It's not even so much about verifying or dismissing its authenticity, but it's about trying to understand exactly how it got where it was and when this happened. If these items were not tossed out the dining room window by some perpetrator before the murder, how was somebody able to stage it after the murder? If Jules' account is factual, it shows that even as people were rapidly reporting to the crime scene, these loot items had not even been relocated yet. While police arriving at the scene and starting their investigation would be combined with all of the neighbors and locals who reported to the scene shortly after hearing Anne's screams, how would someone be able to relocate these items to a loot pile outside of the house without being seen? Sure, one might be able to stuff things like a bracelet or a watch into their pockets and quickly slip them out, but what about the other items that were found there, like the carving set? That's not going to fit in someone's pocket. The killer, or potentially a dedicated accomplice, would either have to relocate these items by taking them from the home, carrying them outside and placing them along the house, or look for the right moment to toss them out the window when nobody was looking. This option would have been extremely loud, with the falling and clanking of multiple items falling several feet to the ground. The perpetrator would have to go unnoticed, despite being in a fairly open part of the home where one could not easily conceal themselves. The option of carrying things out would be more quiet, but one would need to be able to hide all of these items, including, again, a bulky carving set, and still place them in the area that was at least being somewhat scrutinized by investigators and locals. Neither idea makes sense with a limited payoff considering the risk. Furthermore, nobody saw any of this happen. It's just a lingering theory with no logic or definitive evidentiary defense. This would also require the killer likely to return to the scene of the crime, again presuming no accomplice was involved. Whether it was the killer himself or an accomplice, if either one was caught picking these items up or dropping them off alongside the house, the jig would have been up. This action would also have had to happen shortly after the murder, as law enforcement was quick to the scene and this loot was noticed rather quickly. Officer Fleming, who again claimed to have found the loot outside of the Agee home, found this early on in his investigation as he started searching the exteriors of the home. By his account, he arrived at the Agee home at approximately 12:35 a.m., or 15 minutes after the murder took place. By this logic, he probably would have discovered this loot outside somewhere in the vicinity of 12:40 a.m. If one stretches this time figure out to 12:45 a.m., this still gives the perpetrator less than 25 minutes to return to the scene and relocate these items. But if the man seen walking along Willis Boulevard was the killer, he was last seen turning south on Portsmouth Avenue, heading in the direction of Portsmouth and Lombard Street. This intersection is located approximately 4/10 of a mile from where the Agee home was located. Walking this distance at a usual pace would take about 8 minutes, and based on witness accounts, the man on Willis was seen walking for at least a couple blocks. Even if he ran during these other times when he wasn't seen, it would have still taken him at least 5 minutes to reach Portsmouth and Lombard. However, as will be discussed in greater depth later, if this man was the killer, there's reason to believe he reached the vicinity of Wall and Lombard, which is 6 blocks west of Portsmouth and Lombard. On foot, at a walking pace, it would take one about 15 minutes to walk from the Agee home to the intersection of Wall and Lombard. Therefore, if the perpetrator, for whatever reason, doubled back from this location to the Agee home to grab and expose these items, it would take somewhere in the area of 30 minutes from the time of the murder for him to return to the location of the Agee home. While this would likely be too late for this man to return and put this loot outside, it's ludicrous that this man would get so far away and turn back for such an ineffective caper. But, in terms of the case that the prosecution would ultimately present, it was a given that the mystery man seen walking on Willis Boulevard made it as far away as Wall and Lombard. All of this considered, there is no way that this mystery man returned and, amongst several witnesses, relocated a small set of loot to a spot outside the home. So who else could have done it? Who else would have done it? On the other side, if it were Anne, or, as a stretch, an accomplice of hers responsible for disseminating this loot, it would still be very risky, but at least there would be a semi-logical reason to do it. If Anne were responsible for the displacement of these items, one could argue she was trying to push the idea that the murder was a burglary gone wrong, which would deflect light off of her. It would be a lot easier for Anne to pull this off as well, as it wouldn't necessarily be strange for her to be seen holding items that she or her husband owned. She might even be able to sneak these items outside without getting as much scrutiny. This still would have been risky, but the fact of the matter is a pile of items were found outside the Agee home, which requires some form of explanation. If anything, the claim that this loot was faked makes much more sense towards Anne's guilt than some random killer breaking into their home, and yet the defense still pushed the idea. In the end, however, there was no evidence of anyone staging this evidence in the aftermath of the murder, and if it was, nobody can say for sure who did it. While Thomas Jewell is arguably one of the case's most significant witnesses, his account of events, which are critical in arguing the idea that the loot was staged, What he claimed he saw, as well as the actions he took, leave a lot to be desired in terms of his objectivity as a witness. First off, it was the defense's claim that he was the first person to go into the house after Anne, and her children presumably, had left it. But he was not the first person inside. Mrs. Green cleared this up in her testimony about when she and Anne returned to the home. This was just as others in the neighborhood were first reporting to the scene. When they approached the house, Harry was still there by the entrance, choking and somehow clinging to life. A neighbor, Bertha Gagney, had just arrived on the scene and stated that she told Green that she should probably take Anne into the house so she would not have to see Harry lying on the porch, slowly dying. Green complied and led Anne into the house, where they went into the kitchen. This would have been at least a brief moment of time before Jewel arrived on the scene. When Green was inside the Agee home, she stated that she did not see anyone else inside the house when they walked in, nor did she see anyone come inside after they had entered. Green's account flies in the face of Jewel's claim that he entered the house first, and further calls into question if he was in the house at all. And had he, somehow, managed to get into the house before these two women, awkwardly stepping past Harry's body as he was still clinging to life, these two women would have at least seen him inside after they entered. There were no other witnesses to verify his presence inside the house, specifically in the Agee's bedroom. In Jewel's own account, in addition to finding the bracelet and watch, he also admitted to moving a pillow on the bed, directly disturbing a fresh crime scene. It's a wonder why this man would willingly do such a thing shortly before the police had arrived. While granted, disturbing a crime scene was not as strictly enforced back then, one would think the average man of the world would know not to touch items at ground zero of a crime, especially a murder. And it wasn't even like Harry was still there in the bed and Jewel had leaped onto the bed, trying to fight to keep him alive and thus disturbing the crime scene with the best of intentions. This disturbing of the scene was neither practical nor necessary. Objectively, Jewel comes off as a staged witness for the defense, someone who was likely at the scene and thus could have at least verified his presence there, but beyond that, there are no eyewitness accounts that corroborate him as the first person going into the house after the murder, his discovery of these prominent loot items, or his unprovoked disturbing of the bed. It's important to mention here that multiple witnesses who saw the crime scene bed after the killing said it looked generally like nobody had slept on the left side of it, which is where Anne would have been sleeping. Witness Elmo Browse was another neighbor who arrived on the scene and entered the home shortly after the murder. When he saw the bedroom, he expressed that he saw no evidence that someone had slept on Anne's side of the bed. Browse, unfortunately, is another witness who foolishly messed with the crime scene when he admitted to touching a blanket that had been draped on the bed afterward. Browse was accompanied to the scene of the crime by his brother-in-law, a Dr. Clyde Van Vleray, who also saw the scene in the bedroom and described Anne's side of the bed as undisturbed, and he was of the opinion that nobody had slept there recently. He was so surprised by the state of Anne's side of the bed that he asked someone at the scene of the Agees if they even slept together. Edward A. Moss, who lived across the street from the Agees, claimed he was awakened by a growling type of sound that made him think some kind of wild animal was in his yard. When he went to his front window and looked across the street, he witnessed Harry Agee as he stumbled to the front door and collapsed on the porch. His response, remarkably, when he was asked what he did next, was, "I went back to bed." However, his attempted return to slumber was short-lived, and Moss ultimately ended up joining the crowd across the street at the Agee home. Upon entry of the home, he was another witness who saw the bedroom and said that Anne's side of the bed appeared undisturbed. These accounts are critical, as if Anne had been sleeping with Harry, and if she had been aggressively roused from the bed in discovering her husband's state, the area where she was sleeping would have, no doubt, been in some state of disarray. And yet witnesses saw just the opposite of this. Conveniently, with Jewel admitting that he had messed with the bed to some degree, it was easy for the defense to argue away the claims of these witnesses, stating they only saw the bed after it had been altered. Of course, there was no criticism on the part of the defense against Jewel for disturbing evidence at a crime scene, and thus making practically any further analysis of it worthless. Why criticize someone who conveniently helped bolster most of your claims without verification? It is also worthy to note that in my scouring of newspaper articles on this case leading up to the beginning of the trial, in which I found witness accounts from several neighbors who reported to the crime scene in the immediate aftermath, I did not find one account given to these papers from Thomas Jewel. This is bizarre considering he was such a critical witness to the immediate aftermath of the scene, and yet his account did not seem to come to light until after the trial began. Again, there is extensive circumstantial evidence here to suggest Thomas Jewel was not necessarily a fake witness, but a real witness whose account was altered to help the defense and lead to the release of an innocent and grieving widow. This kind of stuff still happens today, but back in the day, the staging and altering of witnesses was old hat. Depending on the circumstances, some witnesses would lie and lie with great pride. If anyone wants to see a terrific example of tampering with witnesses to convict someone, once again, take a look into the trial of Bruno Richard Hauptmann, who was convicted and executed for the abduction and murder of Charles Lindbergh's infant son. But we're not quite finished with Thomas Jewel. Jewel played another critical role in an important question that needed to be addressed about the case. This question asked if, in the aftermath of the murder, were there any lights on in the Agee home? Logically, all of the lights would have been turned off if everyone was in bed. And furthermore, there was no reason to believe that Anne would have turned any lights on as her husband lay dying and as she was running from their home. She also never admitted to turning on any lights, so if there were lights turned on in the Agee home around the time of the murder, then why? And who turned them on? Remember, Miss Green was the first to enter the house after the murder, with Anne in tow. She stated that when they walked into the house that the lights inside were turned on. Again, we have Green's testimony conflicting with Jewel, who again implied he was the first person to go into the house after the murder. He also stated that when he entered the house that he turned the lights on in multiple rooms, including the living room, dining room, and bedroom. Once again, Jewel provided an account that perfectly helped Anne's case. Mrs. Green's husband would also testify that when he arrived on the scene, he quickly rushed to the porch where Harry was laying, and that it was his impression that the lights were turned on inside the house. The importance as to whether the lights were on inside the house or not is that if they were left on, it implies that somebody was awake in the Agee home. Unlike today, where we leave random lights on all the time at all hours of the night, back in this time it was extremely rare for anyone to leave lights on, especially after everyone went to bed. It is completely illogical to think a killer sneaking into the house to rob the place and kill Harry Agee would turn the lights on, only giving anyone inside a better look at him. The lights being on in the house therefore would suggest the killer was not a random outsider, but more than likely Anne Agee, or possibly an accomplice who may have been with her. The leaving on of the lights could suggest that Anne stayed up after everyone else went to bed, before ultimately going in and killing her husband. If we are to believe the multiple witnesses who said that Anne's side of the bed looked like it hadn't even been slept in, this also suggests that Anne did not go to bed, but rather stayed awake. In this vein, she would most likely be in the living room, where she would have the lights on so she could see, without considering the fact that the lights being on in the aftermath of a murder happening in the middle of the night would cause some suspicion. It is understandable then that the defense claimed vehemently that the lights were not, in fact, turned on in the home at the time of Harry's murder, but rather turned on by Jewel shortly afterward. The official story, that could have only been conveyed by Anne, stated that both she and Harry went to bed fairly early, approximately 10 p.m. to be exact. Anne in particular needed to go to bed early as she had a band gig early the following day. By this account, Anne had been in bed more than 2 hours when the killer entered and attacked, but we have no verification for this. She could have easily stayed awake, or, even to fool her husband, gotten to bed and stayed there until he fell asleep before leaving, only to return. Even with these issues, the defense fought to fully vindicate the existence of this unidentified killer fleeing the Agee home. But they also claimed that the razor found in their front yard was not the murder weapon, and in fact played no part in the killing. It's truly a wonder why they would make this claim, aside from their fears that if the razor did belong to Harry, that it might make the murder look more like an inside job. The defense seemed hardly in a position to defensively claim that the razor played no part in the murder, especially since it was found in the front yard with blood on it. What are the odds that a bloody razor would innocently and conveniently just show up in the front yard of a home moments surrounding a murder having occurred there? It seemed the defense was pushing the argument that the razor had also been planted there to look like the murder weapon. The question then is, again, why? Why would a man slit another man's throat and then plant a fake murder weapon, complete with blood, near the scene? Certainly such an act could throw law enforcement off by having them pursue artificial evidence, but still the whole notion of this seems quite implausible. Anne also never saw this razor on her lawn when she fled her home. Granted, if she were truly innocent of the crime, she would have genuinely been fleeing her home in a state of shock and panic, thus easily missing something small like this. We cannot know exactly when this razor actually ended up on the Agee lawn. All we know for certain is that the razor was discovered moments after Anne returned to her home with Mrs. Green. Mrs. Green would testify at trial that as Anne ran towards her house, she heard, amidst the screaming, Anne specifically yell, "Someone is killing Harry." This is very telling in that, if Green's ears were accurate, it implied that the attack was going on as Anne was running away from her home. Another witness who lived in the area, Edward Densmore, would testify that he was roused out of sleep when he heard Anne screaming. He specifically said he also heard her yelling that someone was killing Harry. This suggests that she fled the home while witnessing an individual or individuals attacking her husband, and she was running to get help while the killers were still attacking inside. With her account stating that the killer fled the home before she even made it outside, why would Anne be making the claim as she ran that her husband was in the process of being killed? Even if she were in a state of shock, this statement is troubling. She'd be much more likely to say something along the lines of, "They killed Harry," or "Someone stabbed Harry." She might even yell something along the lines of someone attacking her husband and that he was getting away. These are much more likely claims for her to make considering the circumstances. Assessing the issue of the mystery man seen walking along Willis Boulevard, the defense obviously claimed he was definitively the killer, without question. They had to, even though this couldn't be proven. Collier even misrepresented exactly what this man did as he walked away from the crime scene. He stated that this man ran along Willis, even though nobody saw or heard him running at this time. He then slowed down to a fast walk, but started running again after hearing Anne's screams. Considering all we have to verify this mystery man's existence are the witness accounts of him, it's imperative to mention that the defense's description of what the killer did as he fled down Willis does not remotely match the facts. First of all, nobody saw this man except Gordon Calgan, who could not have seen him till he was already a couple of blocks from the Agee home. He also said that he first saw this man about a minute after hearing Anne's screams. So the defense's claim that the man ran, then walked, and then resumed running when Anne's screams were heard has no evidentiary basis. And if this man resumed running after the screams, then why was he seen walking by Colgan after he heard Anne's screams? None of it matched, but it helped create the impression that this man was acting like a guilty party. He ran and then walked so as to not attract attention. But then, when Anne screamed, he panicked and took off running again. The defense would also make the baseless claim that they could track the killer's movements far beyond Willis Boulevard, which also had no basis to it. One key element of the case that the prosecution primarily focused on during the first day of trial was the fact that Anne Agee had no blood on her nightgown. One might think this would be a beneficial situation to her guilt, as it would suggest she was not guilty of the crime. However, she also maintained that she climbed across her husband's body before leaving the room, wherein she, no doubt, would have gotten at least some blood on her nightgown. And yet there was none. However, if she truly had slit her husband's throat, it appears likely she would have been covered in blood. This is where things get confusing in regards to Anne Agee and her pristine nightgown. It appears logical, based on the circumstances of what happened, that Anne possibly changed into a nightgown after committing the murder, so as to appear without blood on her person. But what would she have done with the bloody clothes she did wear? She would have had no time to hide them, at least in such a way that authorities wouldn't have been able to find them in a true search of the home. Unless Anne had established some ultra-secretive way to stash bloody clothes so as to not be found, this appears to be a stretch of a theory. Had Harry simply died in bed, the idea of Anne changing clothes and having time to get rid of the bloody ones she had on might hold water. However, Harry did come to his feet and make it to the front porch before falling dead. Are we to believe Anne slit his throat and then had time to change clothes and get rid of the bloody ones, and then escape the house before Harry even got to his feet? Not likely, with Harry struggling around and coming to his feet only shortly after his throat was cut. But still, guilty or innocent, Anne should have had some blood on her nightgown. However, the argument was also put forward that when Harry was killed, he was sleeping on his left side, meaning he was facing away from Anne as he slept. Therefore, if she did slit his throat while laying in bed next to him, she would have come up from behind to cut it. Therefore, she would have had Harry's body between her and the blood would have been at least initially spraying out the opposite direction of where Anne would have been. Whatever the case, the defense did their best to use the cleanliness of Anne's nightgown to their advantage. They called a Dr. Frank Manet, a professor of pathology at the University of Oregon, to the stand, and he expressed that in suffering an injury the likes of what Harry experienced, there would have been blood spattering everywhere. Whoever was responsible for this murder would have had blood all over their hands and clothes. While the defense felt this testimony was only to their benefit, it only calls more into question as to why Anne had absolutely no blood on her. She was apparently laying right next to Harry and climbed over his body, and yet no blood. It is also important to mention that at no time did Dr. Manet have access to Harry's body to examine the exact location, size, and nature of his wound to the throat. So his perception that there would have been blood spraying everywhere and getting on everything was certainly an accurate general representation of such injuries, but he was using just that, a general description of all throat wounds, to explain one he hadn't even seen himself. In the actual slit, Harry's throat was cut from the middle up to his right ear. This was not a clean cut from the front, wherein his throat was essentially cut from ear to ear. The cut was mostly to the right half of Harry's throat, implying someone coming likely from behind and to his right when they cut him. This is critical, as a slit like this is not representative truly of a killer coming into the room at Harry from the front. But granted, if Harry was on his left side, much of the left side of his neck would have been buried into his pillow, so arguably an attack from someone walking up to the bed may likely have also resulted in a slit more to the right portion of Harry's neck. This argument that Anne could have come from behind and cut Harry's throat might explain why she got no blood on her nightgown, but it certainly doesn't explain how she could have climbed across his body and not obtained some blood. We must assume at this point that she never did actually climb across his body, and it's a wonder why she would make the claim in the first place. All things considered, during these early stages of the trial proceedings, the prosecution had to consider themselves at an advantage, even with Thomas Jewell, one of the defense's primary witnesses, having testified. They had witnesses to counter everything Jewell had to say, and there were still clear problems with Anne's story. At this time, the defense, for all their efforts to prove a burglary had happened, and a burglar was responsible for the killing, and that there was staged evidence, they had to realize they were fighting an uphill battle. Most of their claims didn't stick, and had little to no evidence to substantiate them. Furthermore, there was already a great deal of public animosity against their client, the hussy. It shouldn't have surprised anyone then that, after the first couple of days of court testimony, that they would flip their whole defense and focus in on one man as the killer that could actually be identified: Joseph Klecker. Chapter 6. A New Defense. Before the first day of proceedings were completed, on July 25th, the prosecution made it clear what their opinion was on the case. The murder of Harry Agee was the work of his wife Anne, and it was driven by her desperate love for her music teacher, Joseph Klecker. They pushed the idea that the Agees were, if not at the end of their marital rope, they were at least beginning to pull apart, and Anne was finding herself falling harder and harder for Klecker. A critical piece of evidence they used to defend this was the simple fact that the affair between the two seemed to be alive and well, leading up to the day Harry was killed. This was not just some fling that reached its peak weeks earlier and had begun to fizzle. By Klecker's own account, which the prosecution presented to the jury, both he and Anne had rendezvoused on June 4th, a week before the murder, at Mount Tabor Park, in the center of Portland. He claimed that they engaged in indiscretions while they were there, likely meaning they were kissing, embracing, and being generally affectionate with one another. Klecker claimed the two met again 3 days later, on June 7th, without mention of whether they engaged in indiscretions, and finally they met one last time on June 10th, only hours before Harry's murder. On the 10th, the two rendezvoused in the Markham Gulch area near Jefferson Street, where they engaged in indiscretions again. As described by Klecker, the area where they met up was in the Goose Hollow neighborhood, just west of downtown Portland. Combined with these claims of multiple romantic encounters in the weeks leading up to her husband's death, the prosecution also presented the case that, despite what those individuals like Harry's brother Fred had to say on the matter, Anne married Harry out of a forced sense of obligation and nothing more. This marriage was, in essence, organized so as to please their families, and therefore was hardly legitimate. It's hard to say exactly where the prosecution found their evidence in arguing this element of the case. Perhaps they were right, but it seems this was more being inferred on their part, with the hopes of presenting witnesses later in the trial who would claim that the Agee's marriage was anything but perfect. Reportedly, one individual who was in the know with the Agees made the claim that Anne had told Harry repeatedly that if he didn't like what she did, or wanted to do, that he could take the kids and go back to Missouri. This certainly serves to shed a light of insensitivity on Anne Agee, especially since she was willing to bail on her own kids, as well as her husband to have the life she wanted. But again, was this actually true? Two critical witnesses who were called at the start of the second day of the trial were Patrolman M.T. Fleming and local eyewitness Edward Densmore. Densmore, again, was a corroborating witness to Anne Agee yelling someone was in the process of killing Harry as she fled from her home. But he was also with Patrolman Fleming when the two of them officially discovered the bloody razor that laid in Agee's yard. They put the time of the razor's discovery at approximately 12:35 a.m., some 15 minutes after the murder. Both noted dark red blotches on the razor, but the court would not allow Densmore to comment on whether he thought it was blood or not. This is understandable since Densmore was just a witness on the block and was not qualified to make such a determination. Densmore also reported seeing a man who attracted his attention at the scene around 1 a.m. This man was dressed up in a striped suit, a nice hat, and he was smoking a pipe. It seems the man's appearance was what made him stand out, especially at the time when most of the people on the scene, besides the police, were in their bedtime attire. He expressed that he learned this man's name was LePage, with no explanation as to how he came to this knowledge, and that he was retracing this man's steps when he stumbled onto the razor in the grass. The implication here was clear. This man in the expensive striped suit may have dropped this razor at the scene as a staged piece of evidence, bolstering a claim that the defense had been making from the start. While this may be served to help one element of the defense's story, they still were faced with an uphill climb. The defense's greatest issue was that they did not have a specific individual to place as the man seen walking away from the general scene right after the murder. Anne Agee was a viable suspect with a name and an identification, but this mystery killer was just that, a mystery. Aside from a few accounts of a man walking on Willis Boulevard, a man who could not be definitively traced back to the scene of the crime, there was really no evidence that anyone other than Anne was responsible. A man fleeing the home was based on her account with no corroboration. The defense needed an identity for this killer, and they needed it quick. Then came July 27th, 1921, the third day of the trial. With the number of witnesses left to call dwindling, the defense made their move and established an identification for the killer who fled the scene. Joseph Klecker, Anne Agee's scorned lover. However, since the murder of Harry Agee, and up to this point in the trial, Klecker had undergone a major change in his life. He had gone off and married another woman in Los Angeles. The marriage took place on July 1st and was used by both the defense and the prosecution to argue their cases. The prosecution made the inference that Klecker had been seeing this other woman and planned on marrying her. This pushed Anne to a point of desperation wherein she decided the only way she could possibly win back Klecker's affections was if she did away with her husband and was finally free to be with him. It was the threat of this other woman that sparked the motive for Anne to murder her husband or to possibly have him killed. On the other hand, the defense argued that this marriage, which did appear to happen rather quickly, was nothing more than a farce on Klecker's part to create the impression that he was not all that into Anne Agee, as some might have presumed. After killing Harry, fleeing the scene and witnessing the aftermath, which included the indictment of Anne, likely leading to Klecker realizing that, one, he was likely not going to be with Anne if she was going to go down for her husband's murder, but that if his affair was ever learned about, it could shine a light on him as a possible suspect. So he downplays his love and affection for Anne by abruptly moving on and marrying another woman. However, there was a glaring problem with this claim on the part of the defense, and that has to do with the fact that Klecker, again, came out and openly admitted to the affair without even having to be coaxed by law enforcement. And not only did he admit to the affair, but he gave a detailed account as to what he and Anne did together, down to their final week before the murder. So if he was trying so hard to disassociate from Anne and the affair he had with her, to the point of wooing a random LA woman into marrying him, why'd he blow that whole facade apart less than 3 days after Agee was killed? If he just needed to get a random girl to marry him as a cover, he could have easily gone after a random Portland girl instead of having to go all the way to Los Angeles to make it happen. It simply made no sense. But, to the defense's credit, they were able to present testimony that called Klecker's credibility into question. It was critical for the defense to do what they could to disprove this affair that Anne had only briefly addressed by implying that she and Klecker were just good acquaintances who played music together. They needed to rebuild Anne's credibility by breaking down Klecker's. In doing this, they would also be able to establish a motive for Klecker as the lone killer. His repeated advances on Anne were met with rejection, and like many scorned and rejected suitors in the world's past, after enough rejections, he was driven to a violent, rage-fueled jealousy. It was in such a rage that he stormed the Agee home and slit Harry's throat before fleeing. More than likely, then, with Anne being indicted in the case, Klecker found it more beneficial to this cause to let things happen and move on to a woman in Los Angeles. But again, once again, why, then, would he come out and admit only days after the murder that he had been in an affair with Anne? Still, the defense did manage to score a strong victory. They uncovered 4 witnesses, all of whom claimed that on June 4th, they met and had an exchange with Anne and Harry. This encounter happened at First and Alder, near the downtown waterfront at the Rebecca Hall. This created a problem, as this was when Klecker claimed that he and Anne met up at Mount Tabor. It is entirely possible that these dates were mixed up by one or multiple witnesses in the case, or that Klecker was off by a day. But the fact that 4 witnesses put Anne and Harry in downtown specifically on June 4th is difficult to argue that they were inaccurate. These accounts served their purpose and quickly began to break down Klecker's credibility. A woman who was walking with her kids was then called to the stand, where she said she encountered Anne Agee on the day that she was supposed to be in the Goose Hollow Markham Gulch area with Klecker. This woman, who, like the witnesses for the June 4th encounter, also knew Anne directly and was thus a reliable witness. She said this encounter occurred in the middle of downtown at Broadway and Washington Street. The account was used to dismiss Klecker's credibility even more. However, this woman stated that her encounter with Anne occurred at approximately 8:30 p.m., and Klecker stated that he did not meet up with Anne until around 10 p.m. The distance between where this woman saw Anne and where Anne met up with Klecker was less than 15 blocks apart from one another, meaning Anne could have easily made their rendezvous in time. These witnesses did not have an entirely impeaching effect on Klecker, but they did have an effect. It is still worth mentioning the convenient fact that on 2 of the 3 days that Klecker claimed he and Anne met up, that Anne encountered personal friends of hers randomly walking around downtown. This is not impossible by any means, but definitely not the most likely thing to occur. No witnesses were called to impeach Klecker on his claims that he and Anne met up on June 7th. Even after these attacks on Klecker, with only some success, the defense still found their case floundering. Their case wasn't helped by the testimony of two Portland police officers, Lieutenant John A. Goltz and Detective John H. Shrum, who both testified that when they spoke with Ann Agee, she was frank in admitting that she'd had an affair with Klecker. This would be just another element of her story that would drastically change. Beyond the focal issue of Joseph Klecker and whether he was just a lover or a murderer, there were other critical elements to the case that were addressed that did not help Ann Agee's case. First and foremost, her son, Vernon, was prepared to verify his grand jury statements that his father owned not one, but two razors, one of which matched the one that was found on the Agee's front lawn. However, Vernon's testimony had to be taken away from the courtroom as, by the time of the trial, he had taken ill with scarlet fever. But he still, from a distance, had an effect on the case. His statements again implied that his father kept two razors in the bathroom, and when authorities checked on this, they only found one still in the bathroom. This only added more fuel to the idea that the bloody razor from the front yard had belonged to Harry. The prosecution obviously maintained that the razor found in the Agee's front yard was the murder weapon and that it had been obtained from within the home before it was used to slit Harry's throat. Their claim then was that after killing Harry, Anne fled the house and in the process threw the razor down on the lawn to hopefully be found and tied to some other unknown assailant later. This would be a little risky on her part, considering fingerprint evidence was very much in play in 1920s crime scene investigations, but maybe she just didn't think that far. Furthermore, with the wet state of the ground, she may have figured this would eradicate her prints. If she was truly smart, she would have used a cloth or a rag to wipe her prints before tossing the razor, but this would have forced her to have a rag of some kind with her when she ran outside. By all logic, she would have tossed the razor with her bare hands. There are legitimate lingering questions as to the circumstances with which Anne would have tossed this razor onto the lawn. However, the razor ended up where it did. After it was gathered up, it was given to Dr. George Cathay for examination. He testified at the trial that the razor was spotted with blood on the handle, on the sides, and on the back side of the blade. There was a lot of blood, but, based on who you talked to, it was potentially not enough to justify the amount of blood from slitting one's throat. This is a difficult point to argue, though, as some blood could have been washed away as it sat in the wet grass. Furthermore, how much blood would have been on the blade used in the murder would vary based on how it was done. The depth with which the blade went in would affect this. How quickly the cut was made would affect this. Factors such as these make it impossible to say beyond a shadow of a doubt, based on the blood amount alone, that this razor definitively was or definitively wasn't involved in the murder. A strike against the prosecution's case in relation to the razor came with the testing of the blood that was on the blade. After an examination of this blood, it could not be determined for sure that the blood came from a human. While it appeared unlikely that a blood-covered razor left in the front yard of a home where a man was just murdered would have had anything but human blood on it, the fact of the matter is that without a definitive identification of the razor's blood type as being from a human, this piece of evidence was destined to die in a court of law as a bona fide piece of evidence beyond any reasonable doubt. They had decided to go all in on one man who was recently married and as a jealous lunatic who'd slit a man's throat only weeks earlier. Inasmuch as Klecker did not have an alibi for his actions in the early morning hours of June 11th, there was nobody who could put him anywhere near the Portsmouth area at that time either. Their case was still looking weak, and report after report were slowly creeping into local media that the defense had their backs against the wall and that it was looking very strong that Ann Agee was going to be convicted of first-degree murder. The defense needed that classic bombshell to happen, and to save their case. Chapter 7. A Murdering Music Man? By July 27th, 1921, the murder trial of Agee was wearing down, and it was looking more and more like she was going to be found guilty of murdering her husband, if nothing more than the fact that she was an adulteress with a questionable story. The defense had their suspect Joseph Klecker, but that case was coming off fairly weak. Certainly he had been deemed inaccurate on at least one date, in which he said he met up for a romantic interlude with Anne. But the guy was just a simple janitor/musician with no criminal record. And beating a dead horse, the guy willingly came out and admitted to having a secret affair with Anne. This was either the act of an innocent man trying to set things straight, or it was the actions of a complete fool who did not realize the repercussions of such an admission. Whatever the situation, the case against Agee was still looking a lot stronger than the case against Joseph Klecker. Anne needed a saving grace, and, perhaps to nobody's surprise, she found that saving grace in her own father. David Jacob Swing, more commonly referred to as DJ Swing in the local papers, was Agee's 65-year-old father, who had been living out his later years in the quiet serenity of Norwood, Missouri, back where Anne had grown up. The moment he heard that she had been indicted for the murder of her husband, Swing picked up his old bones and made the long trek to the North Portland neighborhood of Portsmouth. As he would ultimately testify to the court, the moment he arrived, he gathered what information he could about the case, becoming deeply focused on where this mystery killer went after he left the house. If he was the man seen walking on Willis Boulevard and turning south onto Portsmouth Avenue, Swing started his own personal investigation into the case by picking up this trail where it left off in that area. Swing searched every block, leaving no stone unturned, covering every single corner of the general vicinity where this man may have walked off, looking for anything that might have been evidence of his presence. As his story went, after 10 days of searching diligently for anything, it was July 17th, approximately 5 p.m., over a week before the trial began, when he stumbled onto a bundle of items that had been left in a vacant lot near the intersection of Wall and Lombard Streets. This location was 6 blocks east of the intersection of Portsmouth and Lombard, where the mystery man leaving the scene was last seen walking towards. Swing was astonished to discover that this bundle consisted of a blood-covered hunting knife, a black overcoat with bloodstains on it, and, the coup de grace, in the pocket of the overcoat was a piece of sheet music with blood on it. It appears whoever left this bloody evidence here, he was a man interested in music. After this discovery, Swing commandeered the assistance of a Frank L. Porter, who lived at Portsmouth and Willis, several blocks away. Along with 2 other locals, A.J. Maxwell and O.G. Palmer, the 4 men returned to the site at Wall and Lombard, where Swing revealed what he had found. Reportedly, the ferns that these items had been thrown onto were crushed down and dead, suggesting these items had been there for a while. Swing also stated that there were cobwebs forming on the items, another indicator that they had been there a long time. The men discussed the next course of action, wherein Porter suggested the logical thing, which was to contact the police and report the evidence. At this moment, Swing quickly refused, stating that the police had already given up on the case and were serving his daughter up as a sacrificial lamb so that they could close up the case and get a conviction. After further discussion, the group decided to report the findings to John Collier, Anne's attorney. This is where the questions and concerns begin. After being contacted on the matter, Collier had the evidence delivered to him directly. When this occurred, he told the 4 men who had uncovered the evidence to not discuss their findings with anyone. This evidence then became a secret, only known about by the defense team. Local law enforcement would be up in arms when they finally learned that this evidence had been recovered and not turned over to or even reported to them. This was also extremely questionable conduct in that it gave the defense damaging evidence potentially against the idea of Anne's guilt, and it was evidence that the prosecution had the legal right to know about from the very beginning. But Collier's team kept the evidence under such tight wraps that nobody, not even the judge presiding over the case, knew about it, until Collier decided to reveal it. Thus, this was evidence that the prosecution was not given the opportunity to prepare for. There was also the fact that the indicted woman's own father, after days of desperate searching, was the one who suddenly stumbled onto this evidence that was sitting out in the open of a vacant lot for some 36 days since the murder, and yet nobody else stumbled onto it during this time. And it conveniently even had a little bloody piece of sheet music in it. It was the next best thing to suddenly uncovering Joseph Klecker's fingerprints all over the Agee home after the murder. It was just a little too perfect, and just a little too convenient. And then, with the defense's back against the wall, they suddenly had this ace in the hole to pull out when they needed it. This occurred when Klecker was brought to the stand. It would prove to be one of the more dramatic reveals in the history of Oregon murder trials. As Klecker sat there, defense attorney Collier reached down and pulled out the dark overcoat, stained in blood. A small gasp came over the crowd as Collier stepped towards Collier, the newspaper expressing that he spit out his words like bullets from a machine gun. "Did you ever see this coat before, with the front plastered with blood?" Then Collier wrenched the blood-covered hunting knife from the coat pocket. Another gasp came over the crowd in the courtroom. Collier's voice rose even more. "Look at the knife! Did you ever see that bloody blade before?" Collier stepped closer to Klecker, holding the coat in his left hand as he dramatically waved the bloody knife before Klecker's eyes, hoping to elicit a response. To his surprise, Klecker remained seated, still, unmoved, and described as almost looking half hypnotized. Collier continued to wave the blade in front of him. He began shouting, doing whatever he could to get Klecker to shake or finally break. "Take it in your hand," he yelled, pushing the knife towards Klecker. "Feel it! Look at it!" Collier then shook the coat in Klecker's direction. "Where did you last see this overcoat that had in its pockets this bloody knife with the music sheet that you have just said was Mrs. Agee's?" This last portion of Collier's statement came in response to when Klecker was shown the piece of sheet music with blood on it, of which Klecker implied that it might have belonged to Anne. Just for clarification, he never definitively said this was a sheet that specifically belonged to Anne. And again, if this guy was guilty, why would he make such an admittance? But finally, after the barrage of questions and the shaking around of sudden evidence before his eyes, all Klecker could say in response to Collier was, "I don't know anything about it." Klecker reportedly made this statement very softly in a voice that could barely be heard beyond a few feet. And even by then, Klecker sat still and steady. When Collier first pulled these pieces of evidence, aside from a noticeable buildup of sweat on his face, there was nothing incriminating about Klecker's reaction to seeing this evidence, wherein he didn't have much of a reaction at all. If Collier and his defense team felt they had their man when they revealed this evidence, it had to be a disappointment that Klecker had practically no reaction to it. Had this been his clothing and his knife, it stands to reason that he would have had some sort of semi-shocked reaction to seeing these things suddenly appear in the courtroom, with him lingering there on the stand. Collier stated at this point that he had nothing further to say to the witness in question, at which time Joseph Hammersley, for the prosecution, finally had an opportunity to come to their feet and protest this evidence that they had absolutely no knowledge of. In any basic trial of this make, such evidence would likely have been thrown out due to the secretive manner in which it was kept, along with the suspicious circumstances with which it was discovered. The prosecution then demanded that Klecker try on the coat. Like in the infamous O.J. Simpson trial, where the prosecution caused one of the greatest blunders of the century by having Simpson try on the gloves he reportedly had on at the crime scene only to find they did not fit his hands. It was known that the gloves were shrunken in the process of testing them for evidence, along with the fact that Simpson had on another pair of plastic gloves when he tried these gloves on. They were destined to be too small, whether they were his or not. Now here we are, in 1921, and the prosecution was asking a witness to try on a piece of clothing, with opposite hopes. Instead of wanting the coat to fit, they were hoping the coat would not fit. It seems likely that Hammersley and his team were thoroughly convinced that this was fabricated evidence, and if such was the case, it was a long shot that the coat would fit Klecker well. Klecker stepped down from the stand and put on the coat. He was able to put it on and button it up, but the coat was noticeably tight on his body, likely a size or two smaller than someone of his build would actually own. Arguably, having him put the coat on was not to the prosecution's benefit, even with it fitting rather snug. And after all of this, Collier would not admit the circumstances exactly with which he had obtained this evidence, claiming he would come to that later. But with the revelation of this evidence, the defense team had become totally convinced that it was Joseph Klecker and not Anne Agee who was responsible for killing Harry Agee. He cut Harry's throat with the hunting knife, getting blood all over his coat in the process. He was then seen fleeing down Willis Boulevard moments later in this dark overcoat. When Gordon Colgan saw the man in question walking down the street, he made no mention of seeing blood on the man's coat, but after all, it was dark outside. As Collier shifted the focus of guilt best he could to Klecker, he pushed harder to disprove the idea that any affair had ever existed between Anne Agee and himself. Klecker pointed out that he'd never made it a secret, having told as many as a dozen people he worked with at the Henry Building. Klecker then relayed his whereabouts once again in the hours leading up to Harry Agee's murder. He stated he played a band gig until approximately 10 p.m. on June 10th. He ultimately ended up heading to the Henry Building, which he specifically used to change his clothes, before heading across the Willamette River and heading back to where he lived on Harrison Street. He reported that he reached home around 11 p.m. and went to sleep around 11:30. This was the story he had maintained from the very beginning, but once again, without his sister there that night to verify that he came home, it was only his word, as opposed to an alibi. When Klecker was shown the bloody piece of sheet music, which took a back seat in most newspapers in relation to the bloody coat and knife, even though this specific piece of evidence was really the most incriminating against him as a musician who was giving Anne Agee lessons. Had just a bloody knife and jacket been found, it could have belonged to just about anybody. When Collier presented this bloody sheet to Klecker, he, again, expressed that it looked like the kind of sheet that Anne Agee had. The prosecution simply blew back against this piece of sheet music, expressing that it could not be positively identified as being sheet music that Anne had, nor could it be definitively tied to Joseph Klecker. This was accurate. The bloody sheet music was not a definitive piece of evidence tying him to the crime scene, but it was a psychologically effective piece of circumstantial evidence. If these items were, in fact, tied to the murder of Harry Agee, it would be difficult to not think Klecker was innocent, even if there were no other pieces of evidence against him. The long odds of a random piece of sheet music being in the pocket of the killer's coat while there was a local musician who claimed to be having an affair with the woman whose husband had just been murdered presumably by a man who wore a long dark overcoat, would just be too much for the average person to overlook. The revelations of this evidence must have had a staggering effect on the jury and those present as onlookers for the trial, but there was still nothing to definitively tie it to the murder, aside from the coincidence of it being only blocks from the Agee home. The validity of this evidence is absolutely in question, and Agee's father clearly was not going to stop until he found something that could help his daughter's cause as she was facing the death penalty if convicted. He, no doubt, would have fabricated evidence if it would have brought about a dismissal of charges. Wouldn't you? This does not mean for certain that DJ Swing staged this evidence, but the odds of him magically stumbling upon such items is highly questionable. Even the time of the discovery of these items, again specified as occurring June 17th, is up for question. There are only 5 individuals that are known of that could vindicate this time for finding these items. DJ Swing, Frank Porter, A.J. Maxwell, O.G. Palmer, and, of course, John Collier. Swing and Collier would have obvious motives to be deceptive in this case, but as far as the other 3 men, they very well could have fallen in line, trying to help this dedicated father get his daughter off for a crime she probably didn't commit. The strongest aspect in their story that suggests the items may have been there a long time, left by the murderer more than a month earlier, are the claims that the brush under the items had been crushed down and were mostly dead. They also claim that there were cobwebs, again, forming on the items. But again, with regards to these claims, we have to just take these men at their word. Calling this time of the discovery into question is critical, and that it was highly coincidental that these items suddenly came to light on July 27th, just as the trial was wearing down and it was looking fairly strong that Anne Agee was going to be convicted. If these items were found when it was said that they were, then why were they not introduced until late in the trial? Why would Collier start the trial pursuing the idea that an unknown assailant was responsible for Harry Agee's murder, and wait before putting the heat on Joseph Klecker as the guilty party? Why would he not immediately go with this angle, knowing he had this evidence on hand that included a bloody piece of sheet music? The late exposure of this evidence leaves it open to suggestion that this evidence was fabricated as a desperate latch-ditch effort to create a reasonable doubt to the jury, as well as shifting attention from Anne Agee to Joseph Klecker. Fabricating such evidence would not have been difficult, and would have hardly been a rarity back in these days. Fabricated evidence has always been an issue in trial proceedings, but nowadays it's much more difficult to pull it off. In this case, the individual parties already knew that some kind of blade must have been used to kill Harry Agee. Beyond this, the most distinctive quality of the man seen walking along Willis Boulevard was that he wore a long dark overcoat. And if the objective of fabricating such evidence were to put the focus on Klecker, a musician, it would have been perfect to leave something specifically in relation to music among that evidence. Therefore, we have a bloody piece of sheet music. Fabricating this evidence would have been as easy as obtaining a knife and a dark overcoat. Obtaining some blood could be as simple as killing an animal, not to be graphic, and spreading its blood on these items. These items could then either be kept hidden away by the defense team, which is what they admittedly did anyway, or discarded in the vicinity of Walden Lombard, only blocks from where this mystery man was seen walking. DJ Swing stumbles onto it shortly after. How do we verify the man seen walking on Willis even reached this location? Nobody can say for certain what direction this man went once he reached Portsmouth and Lombard. And why would this killer choose this spot to discard his clothes? It's a critical question to ask. The man fled some 15 blocks down Willis from Jewett, turning south on Portsmouth, and then turning west on Lombard before not only discarding one item, but several in one spot? While the killer would have reached this location roughly sometime between 12:30 and 12:35 a.m., with lots of people in bed asleep, Lombard Street was, and is to this day, arguably the busiest, most traveled street in this neighborhood. It seems unlikely, or at least foolish, to pick, of all spots, an open vacant space along one of the area's busiest streets to ditch this very incriminating evidence. The argument for why the killer might ditch such evidence is understandable, in that the man would have had blood all over his coat, and had he been seen walking or running only blocks from a murder scene, he no doubt would have attracted the attention of anyone else he may have encountered. However, if the killer's primary motive in ditching his coat, with the murder weapon and some sheet music in the pockets, was so as to not be seen with blood on him, why would he not only wait till he reached a busy street to do so? But why would he walk several blocks west on that busy street as well? It could be that the killer was not even thinking about ditching his clothes, but possibly caught sight of someone close by, and it made him realize he needed to get away from this bloody coat. This encounter would have then, understandably, occurred somewhere close to Wall and Lombard Street. As much as I have been critical of this evidence and the reasons why the killer would ditch the items where he did, there just so happened to be a witness called to testify that bolsters the possibility that the killer ditched his coat after coming in close contact with somebody. John P. Bond took the stand and testified to being in the vicinity of McKenna Avenue and Lombard Street, reportedly around the time that the murder occurred. Bond stated that he witnessed a man near the intersection who appeared to be concealing himself behind a power pole. This location was only 1 block east of Wall and Lombard, where these items were found. So did Bond see the guilty party as he fled west on Lombard? Did the man, who obviously noticed Bond, leading him to try and conceal himself, lead the killer to realize he needed to ditch his jacket before somebody made out that there was blood on it? It's definitely possible with the close proximity of Bond's sighting and the discovery of these items. However, there is still an issue with this. DJ Swing would testify that, while he was searching the neighborhood for anything, he learned of Bond's account of seeing this man acting suspiciously near McKenna and Lombard. Swing admitted that it was this account that led him to begin searching that specific area, and he was there where he found these items. A logical story on the surface. However, if we still question the validity of Swing's discovery, then it can be argued that Swing simply used the revelation of Bond's account of seeing a man acting strangely as the catalyst for discovering these items only a block away. While we have no reason to disbelieve Bond's account, it still leaves a light of suspicion on Swing's discovery. Whatever the case, the damage had definitely been done. Chapter 8. The Verdict. The revealing of a bloody coat, knife, and piece of sheet music did not, beyond all doubt, prove that Joseph Klecker was guilty of the murder of Harry Agee, but it shook up the jury, and, upon their first exposure by John Collier, it seems clear they were convinced that these items were more than likely connected to the murder and had been ditched by the actual killer. And with that perspective reached, how could they honestly convict Anne Agee for her husband's murder? DJ Swing's story, as well as his personality, were both almost as critical to swaying the jury, as well as public opinion, as the revelation of these items he claimed he found came to light. A man in his 60s, square-jawed, still a full head of white hair, Swing had the look of a man who'd been busting his back on some rural farm since his childhood, a man who would give it all for anything worthwhile. As he testified, he spoke with a light southern Missouri twang that seemed to charm the Portland city folk who crammed into the courtroom. Swing was likable and admirable. Swing's story, as well, was enough to sway opinion in the case, even if his actions alone were hardly of any evidentiary value in the case. But here was a man, in the twilight years of his life, frightened to his core that by the end of the summer, his own daughter would be convicted and marched to an execution. Despite his age, the moment he reached the Portsmouth district, he put in long hours, searching with futility for something that could prove his daughter's innocence. The notion of a father going to such lengths to save his daughter's life not only was a beautiful story, destined to touch the hearts of everyone present for his testimony, but it invariably cast sympathy on his daughter, if only vicariously through his love and strength of will. Just watching this man testify had to send shockwaves through the prosecution, knowing DJ Swing was a gem of a witness that anyone would want on their side, whether he was being fully honest or not. He manipulated the jury and the crowd beautifully, and one cannot help but want to respect him for it. Certainly he was of the opinion of his daughter's absolute innocence, just in being her father, but with the murder happening some 2,000 miles away from his Missouri home, there's no way he could have known for certain of her innocence objectively. He just did everything he could to try and save a daughter's life. August 1st, 1921. The defense and the prosecution officially rested, leading to the departure of the jury to deliberate on what was definitely the most dramatic murder case to happen in Portland that year. Everyone waited in anticipation, even though it may have been a while before a verdict was reached. But they wouldn't have to wait too long. Only 29 minutes after retiring to deliberate on Anne Agee's guilt or innocence, the jury returned to the courtroom with a verdict. As always, the crowd in the courtroom was warned against any outbursts in response to the jury's decision. By all accounts, Anne Agee, the grim widow, obeyed this to the letter as she sat and watched without so much as a muscle moving in her entire body. All sat quietly as the judge announced the final verdict. Not guilty. The moment the verdict was announced, a crowd of supporters flocked to Anne's side to applaud and console her. She still lingered there, seemingly not all that moved by the conclusion of her trial and the return of her freedom. As they gathered around her, many also gathered around her father. Several jury members were seen to approach DJ Swing and shake his hand, showing their admiration and appreciation for what he had gone through. What more would one need to know the effect he had on this case and why it was so easy in the end for the jury to just acquit his daughter? The case had been like a heaping bowl of oatmeal, sitting and waiting for the duration to be consumed before a giant hand came in and flipped the bowl over, spilling and scattering the contents everywhere. For about 3/4 of this trial, it seemed to most that a conviction was all but inevitable. But only days later, those closest to Anne Agee in the courtroom were celebrating her acquittal. This was already destined to be one of the craziest murder trials in Portland history to that point. But Anne's father saw to it that the craziness was kicked up yet another level. One juror was heard to state on the case, "We can't convict anyone on the evidence we got here. Neither side told us everything they knew." This was a very telling statement in that, even in the end, there was likely still some suspicion of Anne's guilt. But by the time both sides rested, there was absolutely reasonable doubt in the case. The jury also was clearly not impressed with how both the defense and the prosecution carried on. It seemed likely that they too were suspicious of this last-minute evidence brought on by the defense team. But even then, they could not automatically dismiss it, and thus it would be impossible to fully shake the idea that somebody else was responsible for killing Harry Agee. Upon leaving the courtroom together, DJ Swing made the announcement that now that it was all over, Anne would return with him to Missouri, where she grew up. Surely there wasn't much left for her in Portland. Her husband was the primary reason for her relocation, and he was gone. The man she'd been carrying on an affair with had moved on and married another woman. At best, she was likely to still be harassed around town by that fringe group of locals who believed wholeheartedly in her guilt. No matter what she did, there would be no way for Anne Agee to fully shake off the suspicion of her guilt amongst the locals in her Portsmouth neighborhood. It made sense, innocent or guilty, for her to just go back home to a nice, quiet place, thousands of miles from where her life nearly ended. Upon Anne's acquittal, not allowing her to even be tried in the matter again, it was suggested by the prosecution that they might establish a grand jury to look into the matter of Joseph Klecker's guilt. However, as far as the newspapers were concerned, Klecker's name vanished from their stories once Anne's trial was over. This leads me to believe that either they decided ultimately against doing a grand jury in his case because there wasn't enough evidence against him, or they did conduct a grand jury which only served to help exonerate him. I found no signs that he was diligently pursued as a suspect in the aftermath of the trial. Of course, the defense did everything in their power to divert suspicion towards the mysterious musician, but they only did so to relieve attention from their client. Once Anne was free, they had little reason to care anymore. In the final, meek articles written in relation to this murder in Anne Agee, she expressed that before going back home to Missouri, she wanted to help in any way that she could, as far as the authorities establishing a resolution to her husband's murder. Nothing about her statement suggests she either did or did not think Joseph Klecker was responsible. Despite these claims, it appears there was never another real solid lead or suspect in relation to the Harry Agee murder, and yet, not long after making these statements, Anne did finally leave the city of Portland and go home. Unlike her father, I have not been able to determine how much longer Anne Agee lived. But whatever the case, she escaped the summer of 1921 as a free woman. There was definitely evidence pointing to her guilt. There was evidence that was not quite so damaging. Maybe she was justly vindicated. Maybe she got away with it. Maybe she was just a woman suffering a tragedy in her own way. Maybe she was just a grim widow. A final assessment. Before I go into this final chapter, I just want to state this is just some final analysis of the overall case that I am discussing on the matter, addressing a few new items and also going over previously addressed items. So it'll be a little bit different than everything else that has happened to this point. Anyway, the final conclusion. I stumbled onto this case like any other old murder case in the city of Portland, by chance. Searching in general for cases meant searching for dates, people, and sometimes locations that I'd never heard of. Through simple search terms, you're lucky enough to happen upon intriguing cases, and the case of Harry Agee's murder was by far one of the most intriguing cases I've ever found, with its lingering mystery, the classic theorization that the significant other, with their flimsy story about another killer, was responsible, and the clear fact that at some time it was the main story on page 1 for the summer of 1921, only to disappear almost entirely from memory not much later. The final verdict of acquittal for Anne Louise Agee was handed down at the start of August of that year, and before the end of the month there was practically no more articles printed on the matter, leaving us to wonder if the case was even dropped by law enforcement, or, more likely, they just could never get the goods on another suspect. The next closest thing the authorities found was obviously Joseph Klecker, the attractive musician, but they had no proof he was in the Portsmouth area that night, nor could it even be legitimately proven that he really cared for Anne that much. If he was obsessive enough to kill for her in June, then why did he go off and get married in July, less than a month later? And the evidence brought on against Klecker near the end of the trial was certainly intriguing, but could not be honestly accepted beyond a reasonable doubt. The coat and the knife were never tied to him, and, again, once Anne was acquitted, it appears the efforts to pursue Klecker as another suspect were not all that serious, even though Chief Assistant District Attorney Hammersley said that they would consider a grand jury process for him. Since Klecker's name didn't come up anymore than the Agees in print after early August, it seems clear that they could never get solid proof on the man, even during the good old days when fabricating evidence was not only easy but commonplace. Reassessing elements of the case, there's the fact that Anne was reportedly seen without any blood on her nightgown. That alone makes it difficult to believe in her guilt, and considering the fact that there could not have been a lengthy period of time between when Harry's throat was slit and when he stumbled onto the front porch, it's unlikely that Anne changed out of bloody clothes into a much more innocent and clean-looking nightgown. How would she have disposed of those bloody clothes as well, seeing as police and witnesses converged on the home within minutes? This is quite possibly one of the most conflicting aspects of the case because no matter what, Anne had to be there in close proximity to her husband, whether she was the killer or whether she was just asleep next to him. It was expressed at trial that Harry was laying on his left side, facing away from Anne, when she slept on the left side of her bed. Now, obviously, this information could only have come from Anne's own mouth, considering Harry stumbled out of bed shortly after she left the house. If this is factual, then if she were the killer, she could have reached around with a blade of some kind and slit her husband's throat, at which time blood would have been mostly sprayed in the opposite direction of where Anne would have been in that bed. This may have led to the blood making it onto her hand and possibly lower arm, which would have been easy to quickly wipe away. But it's very possible in this vein that blood would not have landed on her nightgown. And again, the portion of Harry's throat that was cut was from roughly the middle to his right ear, giving off the appearance that whoever cut his throat came from the side or from behind and to Harry's right, which just happens to be right where Anne would have been in bed. A critical issue in the case, but based on how Anne specifically stated Harry was sleeping, this would provide a possible reason why she would not have gotten blood anywhere on her. The fact of the matter is, logistically, considering how the blood sprays when someone's throat is cut, Anne should have gotten some blood on her no matter what, especially if she climbed over Harry's body. So the fact that she did not have blood on her neither points specifically to guilt or innocence in her case. Certainly Anne's actions after the assault on her husband can be taken in a multitude of different ways, but they still suggest the logical behavior of a panicked wife who just discovered her husband dying at her side. Again, as she put it, she was awakened by the sounds of her husband, made after the attack, at which time she got out of bed and left the room. She then saw a man with some sort of masking over his face running out of the house. After the reports were made of a man in a long, dark overcoat walking west on Willis Boulevard, away from the direction of the crime scene, Anne suddenly added to her description that the man she saw fleeing the home also wore a long overcoat. Logically, she should have called the police from their home for help, as they definitely had a phone in their house, since the doctor who reported to the house contacted the police from there. But a pass can be given to her in that case if she were truly frantic and in shock over what happened. She instead fled the home and ran to her friend's house a little over a block away, and with her the two returned to the home as others were beginning to gather. As Anne fled the home, she was screaming, which is the primary thing that attracted neighbors in the area to the scene, with more coming out at the sight of Harry stumbling onto the porch, bleeding. This could have been simply the act of a woman desperate for help, and it could have been the act of a woman trying to create the impression that she just witnessed the aftermath of somebody else attacking her husband. It's impossible to say for certain. However, it's also a very common tactic for people who are guilty of crimes they hope to cover up to immediately call or run to their friends, people who will provide a helpful description of their behavior in the aftermath because, well, they're friends. The opinion that became widespread in the newspapers that helped to create an almost insurmountable hill to climb for Anne was the claims from multiple people who say she appeared very unmoved in the aftermath of the killing. This was a critical factor in the grand jury bringing down an indictment against her. This was not to say there weren't claims to the contrary. Mrs. R. Green said that this was absolutely inaccurate. She also happened to be a close friend of Anne's. Another account from a Bertha Gagney also dismissed the idea that Anne was unmoved by her husband's death, wherein she claimed that Anne was nothing but grief-stricken after the murder. This aspect of Anne's case, oddly enough, is one of the strongest elements in defense of her innocence as far as I'm concerned. Again, way back when, in this case the early 1920s, people were not only easily swayed by behaviors they deemed not normal, but they were also easily swayed by mass public opinion. As we should all know, mass public opinion is often inaccurate and yet extremely damaging. Certainly back in the 1920s, these were the days where to be hysterical was deemed just another day at the office for women. Even into the middle 20th century, it was common in cinema for women to break down and faint, even over the slightest shock. Women were expected to be emotionally erratic under these circumstances, and certainly the death of one's husband would qualify as a shocking and traumatic event. Therefore, inasmuch as Anne Agee might have been seen appearing still and unmoved in the aftermath of her husband's death, these people could have been easily witnessing a woman going into a very dark place. Shock and trauma can, and frequently does, manifest itself in stillness, quiet, and a seeming lack of emotion, vis-a-vis shaking, screaming, crying, etc. It is impossible for anyone on the outside to say exactly what Anne Agee's behaviors meant for sure, even if they did go against the societal expectations of that time. In my research, I initially found 3 photographs of Anne Agee from around the time of her trial that stood out to me. 2 I discovered in articles that were published in newspapers in several states, and yet, surprisingly, not in Oregon. The other photographs of her I discovered in the Oregon Historical Society's massive collection of archives. But pictures appeared to depict a wide-eyed and broken woman. In particular, the picture that I found in the Historical Society archives, almost all by itself, made me want to shout her innocence from the mountaintops. Appearances can be deceiving, and if such was the case for this picture, then Anne Agee deserved an Oscar for her performance, even though the Oscars would still be a few years away from becoming a reality at this time. I found a few more pictures of her published in local newspapers again. However, the state of the electronic transfers of these now almost 100-year-old papers were not of the best quality. This left the imagery of Anne looking rather dark and leaving lots to be desired in terms of taking in her appearance as well as her expressions. The picture from the Historical Society depicted Anne in her dark hat with a black veil that graced her appearance during much of her time on trial. She also wore a dark overcoat as she stood in what may have been a general room at the courthouse. The room was modest in appearance, but clearly was not a jail cell or anything like that. She clearly knew her picture was being taken, possibly to be disseminated to the populace, meaning, regardless, that she would have struck a pose that would show nothing but sadness and loss. Her eyes in the picture glanced off to the left of the camera and slightly downward. It was a dead stare, a stare that could cut right through sheet metal, without her even knowing it was there. On the contrary, 2 pictures of Anne that I found in numerous newspapers were headshots of her, presumably taken at various times during the summer of 1921. They don't depict this aura of loss. One picture appeared in a succession of newspapers, mainly on July 7th, 1921, in relation to the Vernon Agee story, as he claimed that his father had owned 2 razors. In this picture, we see a frontal view of Anne wearing a thick-brimmed hat. Her expression is almost one of snootiness, if not possibly giving off an aura of sophistication. The expression is, in fact, lacking in emotion, with her mouth turned up in a smirking manner. If anything, Anne appears almost annoyed in the photograph. Now, this was taken in between the death of Harry and the start of her trial, and the circumstances surrounding how and when exactly the photograph was taken are still a mystery to me. The picture could very well have been taken, say, after the police tried to grill her on what happened. The other picture, which was also published in multiple newspapers, was published mainly at the end of the trial, being published as late as a week after Anne's acquittal. The picture was another one primarily depicting her face, published in relation to the revelations of the evidence that DJ Swing found. Once again, it's a mystery exactly when or under what circumstances this photograph was taken, but considering the timing, it was likely taken during the trial proceedings. Hatless, Anne appears almost about ready to crack a smile, but was likely just striking a general pose for photographers. This picture, like the others published in July, shows an Anne who looks emotionally unmoved. Certainly, whatever the case, these pictures did not help Anne's case in terms of the widespread criticism of her emotional state. In returning to the Historical Society picture, it may very well have been depicting an innocent woman lost over the graphic homicide of her husband. It may have been a total fraud. It may have even been somewhere in between the two. If Anne was guilty in this case, she may have felt beforehand that she could pull this off and walk away all right. But killing someone for the first time is not exactly the same as, say, driving a car for the first time. It is definitely possible that Anne was directly involved in her husband's death, but found herself shaken up and traumatized in the aftermath in possibly ways she never thought would happen. Hence, she could have appeared to be grief-stricken in the case and yet also have been guilty of the crime. As mentioned in an earlier chapter addressing Anne's overall appearance through the few pictures that I could find of her, she definitely had an aged quality to her. She was not that old and yet had well-defined marks going from her mouth into her lower cheeks, which is a more common occurrence in older women. She also gave off, again in images before and after her husband's murder, a sense of detachment. Could this have been the result of being in a miserable marriage for so long? Conversely, could this have been just the appearance of a woman who truly was disconnected from what we may call morality or empathy? The questions are impossible for us to answer, as Anne Agee is the only one who would know for sure. But, considering the circumstances of what happened to her husband, it's definitely of intrigue seeing how weathered and detached Anne appeared to be as a human in general. The Joseph Klecker angle must be addressed. While her defense tried to deny that the affair she had with Klecker even happened, likely to preserve what little of a positive reputation she had at the time, even Anne openly told police that the affair had happened. With the defense then trying to put the guilt on Klecker, the issue needs to be addressed. Sure, Klecker married another woman, but was he really madly in love with Anne and willing to go to drastic lengths to win her over? Was he the man seen walking away from the general area of the Agee home? Was he in a dark overcoat? Did he deposit his coat as well as a bloody hunting knife blocks from the murder scene? I don't think so. While Anne had little to say beyond the admittance, passively, to having the affair, Klecker had much more to say. By his account, Anne had instigated the romance by making moves on him during one of their music lessons. He also said that they rendezvoused several times, including 3 times in the week before Harry was killed. This suggests a fairly strong affair going on, and it arguably suggests a possible motive for both parties. Anne could have killed him to get away from him and have a life with her musician lover. Kleck could have killed Harry out of jealousy to have Anne all to himself. Or it could have been a combination of the two. A theory that never appeared to be considered, which I find strange, is the possibility that Anne was guilty in the murder, but also had a helping hand. Could this helping hand have been Klecker? Or was it somebody else? The idea of Anne and an accomplice appears a very strong possibility, and even stronger than an obsessive Joseph Klecker acting on his own. In this vein, it could be argued that Anne's accomplice came in and was responsible for the actual murder. Whether she actually went to bed at that time, she would have stayed away as Harry drifted off to sleep. She laid in wait for her accomplice's arrival, shortly after midnight, when everyone in the area had gone to bed and likely wouldn't see him arrive. This accomplice would attack Harry, without Anne actually being in the bedroom. This would explain why no blood was found on her nightgown, and why she might stumble on her story about how she got out of bed, since whatever the story was, it was going to be a fabrication. It might explain why her bed appeared not slept in. After the attack, Anne would give the accomplice time to then quickly flee the home before she would run outside screaming for help, getting everyone's attention. If her accomplice was this man seen walking down Willis Boulevard, then we could draw the conclusion that Anne should have maybe given him just a little more time before she ran outside screaming. Trying to conceal the identity as well as the escape route of her accomplice could explain the oddity that Anne was in the living room only feet away when she says the killer ran out of her home, and yet as she ran out she said she had no idea what direction the killer ran off in. As stated earlier, she likely would have been outside within seconds of the killer leaving, meaning there's no reason she shouldn't have seen him. And if he did run up to Willis Boulevard and turn west, why did Anne not see him when she ran the same direction to the green home? There's no reason, even in a state of shock, that she should not have seen the assailant running away from her on Willis. However, in working with an accomplice, the last thing Anne would want would be for that accomplice to be identified, as it would tie, potentially, right back to her. Therefore, as the accomplice fled into the night, she conveniently had no idea where he ran off to. In this theorization of events, the best situation for Anne would be that her accomplice was never identified. So even if this accomplice was, say, Joseph Klecker, it is interesting that Anne appeared to have no interest in putting the guilt on him. Even though this is a guy who wined and dined her, and then, the moment she was indicted and facing possible death, he ran off and married another woman. Despite this, Anne seemed to have no interest in putting the finger on him, even out of just straight revenge for his seeming abandonment of her. After her acquittal, while there were whisperings of Klecker being taken to a grand jury, Anne did not seem to have an opinion one way or another about it. In the one known time that she admitted to the affair with Klecker, the officer she spoke to said that she discussed the affair in a very matter-of-fact way. In this vein, it is possible Klecker was her accomplice and she just didn't want him actually busted for the crime, as, again, it would draw back to her. However, even after being acquitted for a case she could never be tried for again, one wonders why then she wouldn't at least maybe try and nudge authorities in a certain direction. Just as well, innocent or guilty, she maybe just wanted the whole thing behind her after she was set free. The answers to these questions left this world when Anne Agee did. Under the circumstances that Anne was directly involved in her husband's death, again, it can be argued she let the accomplice flee before screaming and running to the green home. She, again, was heard by at least 2 witnesses to yell that they were killing Harry. This implied that even as she fled the home, that Harry was still being attacked. This may have been just what she screamed in the moment, but it may have also been in an effort to make locals who heard her think the killer was still in the vicinity of the home, as opposed to a good distance away. This would hopefully delay anyone from beginning to search the streets away from the Agee home for a possible suspect. The fact that Anne yelled, "They were killing Harry," also implies that more than one person had attacked her husband. This too very easily could have been an effort on Anne's part to portray the murder in a different light than it actually occurred in. It implied that multiple people were attacking her husband, even though in the immediate aftermath she expressed that she saw one man fleeing her home. This does not remotely match with what she was heard to scream, but it definitely helped dissuade onlookers from theorizing about what really happened. Anne ran to the home of Mrs. Green, a close friend who had also been at the Agee home the night before and who expressed that there was nothing off about the way Anne and Harry had acted. This would be the perfect friend to run to for help and consolation, the last person to ever think she would be guilty. They then returned to the scene as the crowd started to gather. Was the man who was seen on Willis Boulevard her accomplice? Perhaps. I would honestly say that I subscribe to the theory of Anne's involvement in her husband's murder with an accomplice more than the theory of her lone guilt or to the theory of another mystery man's lone guilt. Anne working with an accomplice explains the many holes in her case, whether those holes were to her benefit or not. I suppose I can understand why this theory was never truly considered by law enforcement or during Anne Agee's trial, as it took me even into the beginning of writing this book before I really considered it myself. Of course, the angle of Anne working with an accomplice was not to the defense or the prosecution's benefit. The defense tried to push her outright innocence, while the prosecution was not likely to get a first-degree murder conviction if they argued that Anne had an accomplice, especially if the accomplice was the one actually responsible for the killing. Again, as the jury expressed after acquitting Anne, both the defense and the prosecution did a disservice to their cases multiple times over the course of the trial. It was not that there was no doubt as to Anne's innocence, as much as there was so much conflict and deception on the parts of both sides that nobody could have honestly had no reasonable doubt in her case. Before departing from the discussion of Joseph Klecker's guilt, as was being approached, primarily in relation to being an accomplice, I still feel that it was unlikely he was involved. Not only, for the 100th time, was he extremely forthcoming about his affair with Anne, even when nobody was asking about it, he also appeared unshaken when the evidence found by DJ Swing was shown to him. This was evidence he could not have known was going to be suddenly thrust into his face, and even as John Collier brought them out and dramatically waved them in front of him, Klecker did not crack and showed no signs suggesting he recognized the items when they were revealed, or that he felt he was caught red-handed in the moment. Nothing about Klecker's behavior, from the moment he became a name in the case, suggested behavior of someone who was directly involved in the murder. Had his sister just been at home that night, when he said he was there? Who knows where this case may have gone? Would DJ Swing have still found those items blocks from the Agee home? Who would they have argued they belonged to then? Will they have attacked the credibility of Klecker's sister? Who knows? But a strong possibility on that last one. I don't think Joseph Klecker was involved in the murder, but I would not say I 100% believe he couldn't have been involved. And his presence in Anne's life forces us to address another factor which is critical in terms of whether we can truly perceive her as guilty or not. Her motive. There's often relatively few motives people have for killing their significant other. Jealousy, insanity, rage over an infidelity. I guess that's jealousy. A financial gain, like the old cashing in on the life insurance policy scam. Maybe a few others. In Anne Agee's case, there appears to be only two real motives to consider. One, she was in love with Joseph Klecker and wanted to get her husband out of the way so as to have a future with him without dealing with fighting for a divorce, separation with and from her kids, and dramas such as those. And two, Anne and Harry Agee had a very unhappy marriage, much more unhappy than most of those who knew them realized. This unhappiness grew stronger and stronger over time until Anne reached a point where she felt she could no longer deal with it anymore and killed, or had someone else kill Harry. The motive could have also, obviously, been a combination of the two. Anne was unhappy with her marriage, which was a driving factor in her cultivating an affair with Klecker. This simple affair blossomed into something stronger, leading Anne to want to get rid of her hapless husband so she could be with her good-looking, musical beau. It could have been the double indemnity concept as well. For those who don't know, Double Indemnity is a 1944 film noir and an iconic piece of cinematic work wherein a woman, unhappy in her marriage, cultivates an affair with her insurance salesman. She then manipulates this new man in her life into killing her husband. In the end, we realize the wife is simply a bad person and never really loved the insurance man either. So, possibilities? Sure, it's possible. Without a solid alibi, there's always a hanging by a thread possibility that Joseph Klecker was there and directly involved. And was he the mystery man seen walking along Willis Boulevard? Again, I doubt it. Nobody knows who this man truly was or whether he was honestly involved. Like practically every element of the case that serves to defend Agee, it's all based on presumptions and theories. Did a man flee the Agee home? We don't know. Was the man on Willis the killer? We don't know. Where did this man ultimately go? We don't know. Who left the loot outside the Agee home? We don't know. Who was truly responsible for leaving the items that DJ Swing found? We don't know. That was Agee's entire defense, a collection of theories, maybes, and what-ifs, but nothing concrete. On the other end, there's certainly lots of elements used against her that are also unsubstantiated, but there are some definitive strikes against her. She willingly lied about how many racers her husband owned. She should have seen where the killer fled. She should have had blood on her. She changed her story multiple times. She was having an affair, meaning no matter how much one sugarcoats it, she couldn't have had that happy of a marriage. I've addressed multiple times the inaccuracies and presumptions people had about the seemingly disconnected and unemotional manner in which Agee behaved after her husband's death, and that this behavior in no way was a definitive indicator alone of her complicity in her husband's death. However, that said, from a place of personal opinion, something tells me there was a little more to her behavioral patterns than simply mourning in a way that was out of the norm. But again, I'm deviating away into theorization and speculation. The first time I went through the information on this case, I was definitively convinced that Agee had orchestrated the murder of her husband. The second time, looking at the details more closely, I was not quite as convinced. It's one of the many elements of the case that makes it so gripping, is that no matter how many times you go through it, you cannot say that you're fully convinced to a 100% certainty whether Agee was directly involved or not. But, as a final parting perspective, if you put a gun to my head and said I had to make an assertion one way or another, in my deepest gut feeling, I still think Agee did it. And that was my piece, titled The Grim Widow, based on the nickname that was established for Agee in the aftermath of her husband's death and during her trial. It's a piece that I really wanted to do because it was such a big story at the time, and yet it looms in obscurity now. I haven't found any written pieces about this. I haven't found any videos about it. I may even do an actual YouTube video on this where I go to the locations. But it was such a captivating case, and the fact that it's unheard of anywhere else really drove me to want to do something about this case. And it was during this time, it was during the pandemic, and I was out of work for a year, and there was a period where I was just writing a lot. And I just kind of sat down and wrote this piece based on my examinations of the only real evidence that I can find on the case, which were newspaper articles written about the murder itself, the indictment of Agee, and the crazy trial that happened, and the afterword where she said, well, before I return home, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure the killer of my husband is brought to justice. And then, with a whimper, she went back off to Missouri anyway. Again, I like the angle of Agee working with some kind of accomplice, but whether she hired someone to do it or did the murder herself, I just think in the end, even though, again, this is what makes the case so great, is that it's how I ended the book thing. So, it's one of those things you just can't know. There's things that say, yes, absolutely, and then there's things that just say, well, and they make you totally question everything you thought beforehand. It's wild and it's crazy. So I just knew I wanted to write this, and I thought, that's something I can do for when I hit 2,000 subscribers. I can put something out. People say they like my narrator voice, so here's a couple hours worth of that. So hopefully you'll enjoy it. I'm sure listening to this and hearing the evidence I give, some of you may have differences of opinion with me. Some of you may suggest other possibilities that I haven't thought about. That's the miracle of different minds coming together and discussion happening, is there could be something in this case that I totally didn't think of that one of you might ponder or bring up, and I might go like, oh, holy crap, that's an interesting perspective, that's an interesting angle, and it might totally make me reconsider everything I've thought about this case up to this point. And again, one more time, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for supporting me, supporting my channel. And if you're one of my subscribers, thank you for helping me get to 2,000. All that said, this has been Steve, the Amateur Historian.